The very first thing I did after transmigrating to this other world was to sell my noble status, my very surname, to purchase 50 slaves. Everyone assumed I had completely lost my mind, because Highland barbarians are notoriously fierce, brave, and utterly untamable. Unless one adheres to the barbarian customs and truly beats them into submission with one's own fists, they will never willingly obey or fall into line. Hearing this only made me even more incredibly excited, simply because I had awakened the ultimate Lord upgrade system. It allows my recruited subordinates to constantly level up and grow stronger, and even lets me purchase all sorts of miraculous equipment for them from the system store. Therefore, the stronger these Highland barbarians are, the more perfectly they align with my expectations and desires. I was originally the illegitimate son of Calvin, the current patriarch of the legendary Orlando family. Just a moment ago, the city lord delivered some truly terrible news to me. Calvin, the nominal father of this body, had passed away last week, and the one to inherit the marquis title would be my half-brother, Wenger Orlando, and I, as Wenger's sole threat to his family inheritance, naturally became a thorn in his side, a constant nuisance. So, Wenger wished for me to voluntarily relinquish the Orlando surname as compensation. He was willing to pay me 500 gold coins to support me in developing and establishing my own territory. While a noble surname carries significant prestige, it holds very little actual power, and I saw no reason to resist the hostility of an influential marquis for mere empty status. However, I still intended to secure the maximum possible benefit for myself. Good heavens, I declared with an exaggerated sigh of regret from my chair. The Orlando name is a glorious surname, passed down through over a dozen generations of ancestors. It is the most precious thing my father left for me. For me to abandon it is utterly out of the question, unless you considerably increase your offer. Upon hearing these words, the city lord was momentarily utterly stunned by my blatant shamelessness. He couldn't utter a single word for quite some time. But eventually, after a lengthy round of bargaining, subsequently, the I assist incognate and dated 1964 Twitter answers, the city lord agreed to lend me an additional 1,000 gold coins as an interest-free loan, but with the condition that I must purchase goods exclusively from his establishment. My first step in acquiring startup capital was to request a visit to the Big Bean factory to purchase some Highland barbarian slaves. Soon enough, guided by one of the city lord's subordinates, I arrived at the Big Bean factory. The owner of the bean factory, hearing that I intended to purchase Highland barbarians, kindly warned me, "These savages are incredibly ferocious and dangerous. When they get hungry, they will even slaughter and eat crocodiles raw with their bare hands. If you cannot conquer them with absolute power and strength, it's highly likely that, within a few days of bringing them home, these barbarians will beat you down and make their escape." Upon hearing this, I became even more intensely interested in the Highland barbarians. Not only are they incredibly powerful physically, but they can also independently forage for their own food. This means even the issue of provisions and supplies would be effortlessly resolved. The owner stared at me with a completely bewildered expression, his well-intentioned advice being completely mistaken for a sales pitch. This nobleman standing before him must surely have something wrong with his head. But how could the bean factory owner possibly know that I am the man who possesses the ultimate lord system? I have trained diligently for so many years, and all my attributes have already risen to a terrifying level. Today, I can finally showcase my full abilities and talents. Very soon, I stood upon the high platform in the bean factory and loudly declared to the barbarians gathered below, "My brawny big brothers, I have purchased all of you from the city lord. However, I imagine you surely don't wish to remain slaves for your entire lives, do you? Therefore, this young master is offering you an opportunity today. As long as you can defeat me in a one-on-one wrestling match, I will grant you your freedom. But if you lose, then you will all fight for me from this day forward." Among the barbarians who heard these words, Russell immediately pushed aside his companions and stepped forward. "Wrestling, you say? That is what our tribe excels at the most, young master. You are practically seeking your own demise." With that, Russell suddenly made a powerful lunge, charging straight towards me. I met him with a fierce headbutt attack. Immediately after, he reached out, grabbed my collar firmly, and, with a reverse grip, used an over-the-shoulder throw technique to fling me away. After executing a series of incredibly fluid combos that sent me sprawling to the ground, Russell couldn't help but clap his hands together with a triumphant smirk. I truly wondered how capable this little nobleman could possibly be. Turns out, he couldn't even last 3 seconds. With those words, Russell turned and began to walk away, fully expecting his victory. The common folk immediately started showering him with exaggerated praise. Big Brother is indeed mighty and awe-inspiring. This nobleman with his underdeveloped brain is practically begging for death. Little did they realize, however, that in the very next instant, a large hand suddenly seized Russell's ankle. I slowly rose to my feet, met by Russell's face full of utter disbelief. I simply didn't want others to accuse me of bullying a slave. That's why I let you have that one noof. You surely don't genuinely believe you've won, do you? As soon as I finished speaking, I delivered a powerful, heavy punch directly to Russell's waist. Russell was completely and utterly flabbergasted. He had clearly exerted all his power just moments ago, So why was this seemingly frail and short nobleman acting as if nothing had happened? Unconvinced, Russell once again lunged furiously towards me. But this time, the outcome was precisely the opposite of the last encounter. Russell was caught by my over-the-shoulder throw and slammed violently onto the ground. Although Russell was extremely reluctant to admit it, it was undeniably a clear fact. He, a Highland barbarian renowned for his immense brute strength, had been completely overpowered by me in the very aspect he prided himself on the most. It was at this precise moment that a muscular female barbarian stepped forth from the crowd. "I will challenge you to a match," she declared, "and I hope you won't back out after you lose." And this female barbarian was, in fact, the leader of this entire group of Highland barbarians. Upon seeing Gunther, their boss, step into the arena, I immediately understood that as long as I could subdue this female barbarian, then gaining the allegiance of this entire group of Highland barbarians would be a matter of mere minutes. Therefore, I readily accepted her challenge request. In the very next instant, Gunther unleashed her full agility, bursting forth with incredible speed, and rushed straight towards me at an astonishing pace. Witnessing this sight, I couldn't help but freeze in place, completely taken aback. My astonishment wasn't caused by Gunther's speed, which far surpassed that of other barbarians. No, it was because my ultimate lord system had suddenly alerted me that Gunther was a hero unit, and precisely during that momentary lapse of my focus, Gunther's powerful fist was already smashing directly towards my face. Fortunately, I managed to successfully block my face with my arm just in time, thus preserving my exceptionally handsome features from any harm. However, this also gave me a much more direct and intuitive understanding of Gunther's true power. She truly lives up to being a hero unit, even recognized by the system itself. Her strength is significantly greater than that of an ordinary barbarian. Gunther, whose first attack had failed, gave me absolutely no chance to catch my breath. With a powerful leap, well few axed and massed of, she launched another ferocious attack against me. Gunther's incredible explosive power even managed to smash a deep crater into the arena's flooring. Amidst the deafening cheers and shouts of her barbarian compatriots around her, Gunther effortlessly lifted a massive boulder weighing 1,000 pounds, and with lightning speed before I could even react, she hurled the enormous stone directly towards me. I was too slow to dodge, and could only watch helplessly as the colossal boulder crashed down upon me. With a thunderous crash, a colossal impact, the massive boulder slammed mercilessly onto my body. Gunther, with a triumphant expression, stood atop the boulder, basking in the praise of her subordinates. However, in the very next moment, the massive boulder beneath Gunther's feet suddenly began to tremble slightly. Then, under the utterly astonished gazes of the other Highland barbarians, I effortlessly lifted the enormous boulder with a single hand. "Your speed and strength are both quite impressive, I must admit. However, you won't be able to defeat me with brute force alone. Let's continue, shall we?" Before I could even finish my sentence, Gunther swiftly flashed, appearing directly behind me. The iron chain in her hand, like a nimble serpent, suddenly tightened around my neck. Then, with a powerful pull, she abruptly exerted force, firmly pinning me to the ground. Just as Gunther confidently believed she had secured her victory, I effortlessly ripped the iron chain completely apart with a single pull. Gunther stared with a face full of utter disbelief at the iron chain which I had torn apart with my bare hands. It was important to note that this particular chain had been forged by the dwarves' most exceptional craftsmen, crafted from special, incredibly durable materials. It was designed to restrain even a mighty dragon, and would do so without any issue whatsoever. I paid no mind to the astonished gazes of the crowd. Instead, I gazed at Gunther with an expression of deep appreciation. She possessed great strength, and also demonstrated a degree of strategic thinking. I was exceedingly pleased with this prospective subordinate. However, my continuous refusal to utilize my true power had instead made Gunther feel deeply insulted. Therefore, Gunther desired me to fight her with my absolute full strength. Otherwise, she declared, it would be impossible for her to ever submit to me. Hearing this, I offered a faint smile. Such an outrageous request. This is truly the first time I'd ever encountered one. In the very next moment, after fulfilling my promise, I unleashed a technique that channeled my full power, launching a fierce straight punch directly at Gunther. Then, with a powerful leap, I utilized the very same tactics Gunther had just employed against me, triumphing over him and leaving Gunther utterly convinced of his defeat. He was completely and entirely subdued by my power. Consequently, he decisively rose to his feet and loudly proclaimed to his subordinates, "All barbarians, heed my command. From this day forward, this noble individual shall be our new chieftain. We must pledge our unwavering loyalty and serve him until death." As I observed the first group of subordinates I had gained in this new world, I couldn't help but make a grand and boastful promise to them. Work diligently by my side, my brothers, and next year I'll ensure you all have a few more wives. However, my immediate priority now is to procure some weapons and armor for these new followers. After all, this is the simplest and quickest method to enhance their combat prowess. So, with a very generous demeanor, I addressed the owner of the weapons shop, saying, "Bring out the finest equipment your shop possesses. I intend to outfit all my brothers with a suitable set of gear." The moment the shop owner heard this, he instantly understood. This noble standing before him was undoubtedly a naive, wealthy, and easily exploitable mark. Without hesitation, he pressed a mechanism on the wall, revealing the superior merchandise hidden behind a secret door. After learning that the Highland barbarians typically used spears and javelins as their primary weapons, I planned to equip each of my subordinates with 1 spear and 3 javelins. The astute shop owner immediately quoted a price of 750 gold coins. I promptly handed over all the gold coins I possessed, hoping the owner would give me a discount, seeing me as a potential friend. Upon hearing my request, the shop owner's expression instantly changed. My apologies, but this establishment never conducts business with paupers. Seeing the situation unfold, I straightforwardly offered him the treasured sword I held. What if we were to include this dragon-slaying sword as well? The moment the owner heard the name of this legendary weapon, he was so terrified that he practically soiled himself. A noble who possesses such a divine artifact must surely be an exceptionally important figure. I absolutely cannot afford to offend him. He immediately declared that making friends was his greatest pleasure. All your purchases in my store today can be put on a tab. Upon hearing this, I immediately pressed my advantage. I had the shop owner arrange 50 pieces of fine leather armor for my men. After everyone had donned their new equipment, Ganther inquired of me, "What do we intend to do next?" I flashed a mischievous smile. "Why, of course, we make a swift escape. After all, the name Dragon-Slaying Sword was merely something I concocted to fool the shop owner." Soon after, our group appeared in the untamed wilderness outside the city. With 50 subordinates in my command, I now felt terrifyingly powerful. Therefore, it was high time to claim a territory of our own. However, no sooner had we stepped into the wilderness than we were spotted by a bandit gang comprised of goblins and gnolls. These bandits, seeing that our numbers were few, even before the fight began, almost started arguing amongst themselves over how to divide the spoils. At this moment, Ganther also noticed the little tails tracking us, yet I remained completely unperturbed. First, I ordered my subordinates to halt in place and prepare for combat. Then, I pulled a pouch of pills from my satchel and instructed Ganther to distribute them. After taking one myself, I informed everyone, "This, my friends, is the legendary Sao Goes Wild Elixir. It's a miraculous medicine capable of rapidly boosting your strength." Although everyone suspected the medicine was fake, they quietly swallowed it due to my commanding presence. No, their guess wasn't entirely wrong. This fake medicine was actually just a cover for my system's operations. You see, after these Highland barbarians declared their allegiance to me, my strongest lord system had received their applications to join my party, and once these Highland barbarians gained experience points from participating in battles, their strength would skyrocket due to leveling up. At that point, no matter how simple-minded they might be, they would surely sense that something was amiss. Therefore, I had to carefully guard my secret and provide a plausible explanation for the system's powerful effects. Soon enough, the bandit group assembled, and their forces charged towards us. Seeing that these bandits had entered my attack range, I excitedly brandished my spear and swiftly hurled the spear with immense force. The spear carved a sharp arc through the air, flying precisely towards the enemy leader. However, the opposing leader managed to block it with his heavy armor. Although my formidable power made the goblin leader feel threatened, he considered his army's numbers to be a fundamental advantage over ours. This overwhelming numerical superiority made him believe we were nothing to fear. Swiftly, the forces of both sides converged on the battlefield like a surging tide. In the ensuing close-quarters combat, the barbarian warriors, clad in leather armor and wielding spears, faced off against the ragtag bandits. They vividly demonstrated the meaning of gear suppression against gnolls who possessed only raw courage. Under the assault of the barbarian warriors, the gnolls fell rapidly, but the numerical disparity couldn't be overcome by strength alone. Soon, the barbarian warriors were completely encircled by the wilderness bandits. Ganther grew anxious at this point, and asked me with a panicked expression, What should we do now?" I calmly climbed onto the roof of the carriage, and asked Ganther for another spear, because to turn the tide of battle when disadvantaged is actually not difficult at all. As long as they feel the imminent threat of death, that disorganized rabble on the other side will collapse without us even needing to attack. In the very next moment, the spear in my hand, resembling a streak of lightning streaking across the night sky, moved with the force of 1,000 thunderbolts, violently carving into the carriage roof. The instant the spearhead made contact with the carriage roof, fierce flames immediately ignited on its tip. With a powerful motion, I thrust the flaming spear in my hand, launching it directly at one of the enemy's monstrous giants. The spear accurately struck the giant's head, instantly decapitating and eliminating it on the spot. The death of their strongest warrior, the giant, immediately struck terror into the hearts of the other monsters in the bandit group. They instantly began to scatter in all directions, retreating even faster than they had arrived. Witnessing this, the barbarian warriors' morale soared, and they immediately launched a counterattack. Their long history of hunting had made the barbarians exceptionally skilled in slaughter. Their opponents were like helpless sheep, falling one after another beneath the butcher's blade. Seeing that his own side was on the verge of being completely wiped out, the enraged goblin leader emerged, glowing with a green aura. However, I was in no hurry to engage him. Instead, with a triumphant smirk, I mockingly asked, "Aren't you worried that by ambushing us here, a more powerful race might swoop in and steal the spoils? The goblin leader scoffed, dismissing my words with a disdainful smile. The closest other race around here are just those pathetic mountain kobolds. Indeed, even if they had 10 times the courage, they wouldn't dare challenge me. It was only then, upon hearing this, that I truly smiled. I had been wondering where to expand and establish my own territory. Thank you for providing us with such valuable information. With that said, I drew forth the dragon-slaying sword, and effortlessly struck down the goblin leader, killing him on the spot. Dog Mountain Fortress was situated at a high altitude, making it easy to defend and difficult to attack. I had originally anticipated a fierce and challenging battle, but it turned out the fortress's guards were merely 2 small teacup poodles. With a mischievous grin, I gave my subordinate a knowing glance. The kind of hint you understand. Meanwhile, on the other side, the kobold chief was busily studying foreign languages in his room. However, their scholarly endeavors were instantly interrupted by my forceful entry. Seeing the commotion, the kobold chief stuck out his tongue and, with a loud cry, announced, "Intruders! An assassin has broken into my royal chambers." But the ones who burst through the door were my subordinates, having already dealt with the few watchdogs guarding the entrance. Upon hearing this, the kobold chief instantly flew into a rage. "I have hundreds of my kin brothers all around this area. If you dare, try to lay a hand on me." However, in the very next moment, I directly lifted the kobold chief upside down. "What was that you just said?" I didn't quite catch it clearly. After a period of persuasion, I instructed Ganther to release the kobold chief. This was simply because kobolds are a nasty species that always seek vengeance. After he ran off, he would undoubtedly gather his nearby brethren to seek revenge. Rather than having to search for them in every single place, it was better to let them come to us voluntarily. This way, I could easily plunder everything they possessed. After all, my funds were nearly depleted from purchasing the Highland barbarians. My money was almost entirely spent. If I didn't acquire some more resources, it seems we might soon struggle even for our next meal. Later that very night, a subordinate tasked with patrol duties rushed in to report, "Boss, we have a serious problem. Not far beyond the city walls, an enemy force has set up camp. It appears their intention is to launch a surprise attack against us." Upon hearing this news, I excitedly slammed my hand on the table and leapt to my feet. "Brothers, it's time to rise and get to work. We're going to raid them and seize everything, leaving them with absolutely nothing, not even their undergarments." After discreetly observing the enemy's forces through my spyglass, I quickly realized that this particular contingent intending to ambush us was comprised of goblins whose fighting capabilities were not particularly formidable. Recognizing this, I immediately decided to significantly alter our original battle strategy. I would lead a small, specialized team, accompanied by Gunther, to carry out a stealthy ambush. My goal was to swiftly capture them all in one fell swoop, moving with lightning speed, and in doing so, firmly establish our dominant position within High Mountain Fort. However, to my complete surprise, these goblins, who were supposed to be launching a sneak attack, were astonishingly lacking in any form of vigilance. Instead, each and every one of them was deeply asleep within their tents, completely unaware. Gunther, of course, was not one to let such a rare and golden opportunity slip away. With a swift practice motion, his blade fell. Still deeply immersed in their slumber, the goblins who remained unwilling to awaken were immediately subjected to a brutal slaughter. As for the few goblins who, by sheer luck, managed to survive the initial wave of the surprise attack, they were met, just as they scrambled out of their tents, with the deadly onslaught of the Highlander barbarians. However, just as Rossel was confidently assuming our victory was already secured, the very ground beneath Rossel's feet began to rumble and shake with a sudden, alarming intensity. Following a tremendous, deafening boom, Rossel was violently thrown backward, flung directly through the air. The perpetrator of this attack was none other than a dragonkin goblin, imbued with the potent blood of a dragon. This dragonkin goblin was not only significantly larger in stature than even our formidable Highlander barbarians, but it had also already developed prominent dragon horns on its head. This clearly indicated that the concentration of its draconic bloodline was exceptionally potent. As the dragonkin goblin let out a ferocious, enraged roar, the very ground beneath them seemed to be instantly ripped apart by an immense, unseen force. A colossal creature, moving like a monster's pangolin, suddenly burst forth with immense force from beneath the earth. The dragonkin goblin nimbly vaulted onto the back of the colossal monster, straddling it with ease, brandishing a massive, formidable axe high above its head. It then declared with brazen arrogance, "You utterly contemptible outsiders. Prepare yourselves now to face the righteous judgment of the noble dragon bloodline." Gunther, unable to tolerate such blatant disrespect, roared, "Dragon, your ass," and fiercely hurled the spear clutched in his hand. However, the only sound that followed was a resounding ding of impact. His full-force attack, launched with all his might, the spear he had so powerfully thrown, could not even penetrate the colossal monster's mystic armor. "What in the bloody blazes is this abomination?" Gunther's face was a mask of utter shock and terror, as if he had just witnessed a ghost. Yet, even in that brief moment of Gunther's stunned hesitation, the dragonkin goblin had already urged its formidable mount forward, charging directly into his immediate presence. "Now, prepare to experience the noble and superior power of the dragon bloodline." It was precisely at this critical juncture, this very moment of life or death peril, that I, with a sudden flash, instantly materialized directly in front of Gunther. With immense force, I seized the colossal monster's left forepaw in a powerful grip, and with nothing but raw, unadulterated brute strength, I effortlessly flung the giant monster through the air. With a single, decisive move, I had struck the colossal beast, rendering it completely immobile and collapsing to the ground. I gazed down at the dragonkin goblin, who was also lying prostrate on the ground, unable to rise for a considerable time, and arrogantly declared, "You foul, mongrel offspring of a repulsive lizard and a mere goblin, how dare you flaunt your paltry bloodline before me, a true scion of dragons? Do you truly believe yourself worthy?" My profoundly insulting words, crafted to sting, had completely and utterly infuriated the dragonkin goblin. It brandished its colossal axe with fury, and without a moment's hesitation, launched a direct assault upon me. However, in the face of truly absolute power, all forms of resistance invariably proved to be utterly futile. I effortlessly caught its immense axe with my bare hands, and simultaneously, with a single, decisive punch, I brought an end to its pathetic existence. As the dragonkin goblin finally collapsed to the ground, this fierce battle was, at this very moment, officially declared to be at its end. The Highlander barbarians immediately began to enthusiastically scour the battlefield, eagerly collecting their spoils of war. Disappointingly, however, all they managed to find was a paltry small chest filled with silver coins. Had it not been for Gunther, who, remarkably, managed to gain 2 levels during this very battle, and successfully managed to tame the formidable mount of the dragonkin goblin, our efforts in this particular battle would have resulted in a truly colossal loss. Consequently, finding myself with little to do and a touch of boredom, I decided to browse through the system's expansive marketplace. However, my utterly empty wallet left me with absolutely no meaningful choices whatsoever. All the wealth I possessed, from head to toe, was only sufficient to purchase a single, old-fashioned knight's lance. Upon attempting to click the purchase button, a remarkably handsome knight's lance materialized out of thin air, appearing firmly in my grasp. I had initially intended to thoroughly test the formidable power of this new weapon. Yet, I was suddenly interrupted by the faint, yet unmistakable sounds of a ferocious skirmish, accompanied by shouts and the unmistakable clang of weapons colliding. I promptly pulled out my spyglass and directed my gaze towards the source of the commotion, only to discover a merchant caravan, not far in the distance, was currently under a brutal assault by a pack of gnolls. Merely by observing the sheer number and impressive scale of their wagons, it was immediately evident that the wealth possessed by this caravan must be truly astonishing. While I certainly had the option of waiting until the caravan had been utterly annihilated, and all their valuable goods had been seized by the gnolls before making my move, which would, in turn, allow us to legitimately acquire a significant windfall. However, I considered my future plans for expanding my territory, and the necessity of engaging in trade and commerce. If I were to intervene and rescue them at this very moment, they might very well assist me in establishing crucial trade routes in the future. By this point, the caravan's desperate guards had been completely overwhelmed, clearly losing ground in the ongoing battle. The caravan's distressed leader, staring at the ferocious and bloodthirsty gnolls, pleaded softly, his voice trembling, "I am willing to relinquish all the money and provisions I possess to you. I beg of you, please just spare our lives and let us go." However, the gnolls, now in a state of bloodthirsty frenzy, were utterly incapable of comprehending or heeding his desperate plea. Just as one particularly grim-faced gnoll was preparing to deliver a brutal, lethal strike, a spear, suddenly arcing through the air, unerringly struck and pierced clean through its body. This sudden and unexpected turn of events instantly caused the jaws of the remaining gnolls to drop in utter astonishment. From my distant vantage point, I observed my handiwork with satisfaction, letting out a confident chuckle. The lance provided by the system is, as expected, remarkably effective. Concurrently, Gunther, leading the formidable main contingent of Highlander barbarians, also initiated a powerful charge. However, I had no intention of personally intervening in the ensuing combat. These gnolls were, at best, nothing more than a disorganized motley rabble. Therefore, I intended to use them as a training exercise to hone my team's coordination and mutual understanding. My loyal subordinates certainly did not disappoint my expectations. In merely a few fleeting moments, they successfully cut down the majority of the gnolls, leaving them slain on the very spot. Only a very small handful of gnolls managed, by sheer chance, to escape the battlefield. Ultimately, His Majesty, the colossal monster that had suddenly burst forth, blocked their escape path, delivering the ultimate, soul-silencing blow to them. A victory achieved in this manner, without any direct intervention required from my part, yet a thoroughly satisfying and complete triumph, left me feeling immensely pleased and satisfied. The grateful, rescued merchant caravan. The members of the caravan immediately began to profusely express their heartfelt gratitude to us. However, I, utterly unfazed by their theatrics and with a touch of exasperation, declared, "If you genuinely possess true sincerity, then simply provide me with monetary compensation, and that will suffice." It was at this precise moment, from within one of the caravan's opulent carriages, a young woman's distinctly mocking voice suddenly echoed forth, "Well, this avaricious noble lord is certainly an amusing character. I turned my gaze towards the source of the voice, only to discover the young woman inside the carriage was remarkably fair-skinned and exquisitely delicate in appearance. More importantly, however, her ears were noticeably more pointed and elongated than those of a typical human. It was then that I suddenly realized the leader of this entire merchant caravan was, in fact, a captivating half-elf maiden. Given that their caravan had suffered extremely heavy losses during this recent skirmish, the young woman expressed her hope that I would grant them refuge for a few days, allowing her subordinates to recuperate briefly on my territory as a form of compensation. Their caravan was prepared to offer both weaponry and gold coins as a suitable form of recompense. Upon hearing these terms, I promptly and decisively accepted their offer, for High Mountain Fort, as a rule, would never, ever turn away a wealthy patron. The very first thing the half-elf maiden did upon her return to High Mountain Fort was to retrieve a clear glass vial and begin carefully concocting a healing potion. However, I could discern at a single glance that this was no ordinary potion but a powerful healing elixir, blessed and meticulously developed by an advanced wizard. Merely consuming a tiny amount of it could achieve the same potent effects as a low-level healing spell. I had long harbored a desire to accumulate a substantial reserve of such invaluable items for our military provisions, but their prohibitively high cost had always compelled me to abandon the idea. It appears the merchant caravan supporting this half-elf maiden possesses far greater influence and resources than I had initially anticipated. Later that very night, just as I was leisurely basking in the tranquil glow of the moonlight, Gunther, with a look of deep concern, urgently rushed over to report on the situation. "Boss, we have a grave problem. Outside the city, a large group of heavily armed centaurs are charging directly towards us." Simultaneously, the scene unfolding outside the formidable walls of High Mountain Fort was charged with an entirely different, tense, and chillingly grim atmosphere. The young woman leading the charge gazed ahead, her eyes cold, unyielding, and fixed with unwavering determination. As a direct consequence, the moment they encroached upon High Mountain Fort's established warning perimeter, a countless volley of long spears was launched with incredible speed, hurtling directly towards their formation. Each one ultimately slammed with formidable force into the very ground directly before them. The leader of the centaur contingent immediately understood that this was a clear and unequivocal warning issued by the master of High Mountain Fort intended as a serious deterrent. Should they dare to cross the precisely marked boundary indicated by these spears, then there would be absolutely no possibility for any further negotiation or de-escalation between the two parties. They would immediately and irrevocably plunge into a full state of open warfare. However, the centaur leader displayed an utter disregard for this explicit warning, and instead proceeded to command its large contingent to continue their advance directly towards the city walls. Witnessing this audacious display, I found myself involuntarily narrowing my eyes. They actually disregarded my warnings. It seems these centaur forces are truly intent on waging war against us, and so, without further hesitation, I hoisted the long spear high above my head and bellowed commands to my loyal subordinates to show no mercy and let them witness the true extent of our power. However, to my utter astonishment, just as our long spears were mere inches from their forms, the centaur maiden swiftly unsheathed a scimitar from her waist, and with an almost impossible acrobatic maneuver, precisely severed every single spear we had launched. Then, to my growing surprise, they instructed their centaur contingent to immediately halt their forward advance. Then, with a rather shy expression, produced a long hidden piece of white cloth, and used one of the fallen spears to hoist that white cloth high into the air. The robust Gunther, with a look of utter bewilderment, then turned to me and stated, "Boss, it appears they've raised a white flag, signaling their surrender." This profoundly bizarre turn of events left me completely dumbfounded for a solid 2.5 seconds as well. How could they possibly surrender before the battle even began? However, given that these centaurs' true intentions remained shrouded in mystery, I therefore instructed Gunther to remain with the bulk of our forces, defending Highland Fortress, while I, accompanied by a few other subordinates, cautiously advanced to inquire about their purpose. Upon seeing my approach, the centaur maiden immediately lowered her torso in a respectful bow towards me. Stating, "I am Hurt, the chieftain of the Swiftwind clan," she began, "and I have come here bearing only goodwill and peaceful intentions." As she spoke, and to further illustrate her point, Hurt then produced a fan-shaped ox scapula from a pouch she carried. I accepted the bone from her, and proceeded to examine it thoroughly and meticulously, only to discover that the inscriptions etched upon it were utterly incomprehensible to my eyes. It was then that Hurt, with admirable patience, began to explain that the indigenous tribes in the surrounding region were actively attempting to assemble a formidable allied army, and this very item, she clarified, was their formal invitation. Upon hearing this crucial detail, a sudden realization immediately dawned upon me. Highland Fortress, of course, had historically been the territory of the indigenous kobold tribes, and I surmised they were now intent on uniting the strength of several such tribes to forcibly reclaim Highland Fortress as their own once more. Hurt unequivocally affirmed my suspicions, and further informed me that these indigenous forces were also aided by enigmatic shaman warlocks, whose combined power was absolutely not to be underestimated. At this point, I decided to voice the question that had been perplexing me for quite some time now. Why, I inquired, do you centaurs choose to offer your assistance to me, rather than aligning yourselves with these indigenous tribes? Hurt? With righteous indignation filling her voice, she retorted, our Swiftwind clan are in fact descendants of half-orcs, tragically forced to abandon our ancestral lands. Therefore, even if it meant facing certain death, we would never willingly stoop to colluding with those thieving native barbarians. Immediately thereafter, Hurt once again performed her respectful bow, and formally saluted me, declaring, the Swiftwind clan is eager and willing to officially join Highland Fortress. From this moment forward, we pledge to raise our blades in defense of your honor. Our sole hope is that one day, with the guidance of a mighty lord such as yourself, we may finally restore the lost glory of our venerable clan. As I observed the system's official request for their enlistment, I readily and joyfully accepted their terms. The very fact that the system acknowledged and processed the Centaur's application to join was sufficient proof that they harbored no treacherous intentions or ulterior motives, not being double-crossers. This, I mused, was indeed one of the system's subtle yet invaluable hidden benefits. Furthermore, the available intel indicated that Centaurs were highly proficient ranged combatants, masters of the bow and arrow. This perfectly addressed the existing deficiency in ranged firepower among my current forces. Upon our return to the formidable Highland Fortress, I immediately conveyed the imminent news of war about to engulf this region to the half-elf maiden. Moreover, I estimated that the enemy's main contingent would arrive in a mere 10 days at the absolute earliest. Upon hearing this vital information, the half-elf maiden secretly let out a silent sigh of profound relief. 10 days, she mused, would be just enough time, ample time to await the arrival of their merchant caravan's reinforcements, and then to calmly and strategically make their retreat. Gunther, however, upon overhearing these words, became exceptionally animated and excited, exclaiming that more free weapons and valuable supplies were now practically being delivered right to our doorstep, while I personally felt not a shred of panic regarding the impending enemy forces, remaining completely unfazed by their approach. Nevertheless, to be absolutely prepared for any unforeseen contingencies, I shamelessly turned to the half-elf maiden and audaciously proposed, Miss Annie, with the gravest of threats now looming before us, given the immense peril we now collectively face, would your esteemed merchant guild be so gracious as to lend Highland Fortress 500 gold coins? Although the half-elf maiden harbored a strong suspicion that the lent funds might never be recouped, she understood the precariousness of her current situation, trapped beneath our roof, so she magnanimously agreed to the loan without any further dispute. And surprisingly, she did not even mention charging any interest on the sum. The very first action I took upon receiving these much-needed funds was to promptly head to the system store and embark on a vigorous shopping spree, taking into account the recently enlisted Centaur warriors, and noting that these new subordinates were still lacking proper equipment, I grandly gestured, making a decisive choice, and directly purchased a formidable Purple Mountain longbow for every single Centaur warrior from the system's inventory. The Centaur maiden took one of the longbows and decided to test its capabilities. With incredible power, as Mextias termed it with a Lakshaf, as the bowstring vibrated with a resonant thrum, a remarkably swift arrow sliced effortlessly through the very air itself, and astonishingly, it struck its target dead on, 100 meters distant, an unsuspecting little bee that was apparently studying a foreign language. Witnessing this impressive display, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The Centaur warriors, now armed with such potent weaponry, had their combat effectiveness elevated by an immeasurable degree. It was at this very moment, in fact, that one of my subordinates, sprinting urgently towards me, abruptly interrupted my thoughts. Boss, something dreadful has occurred. We've just discovered that the merchant caravan's reinforcement troops appear to have been ambushed. Upon hearing this alarming news, I instantly led my subordinates to the reported location to investigate, only to tragically discover that the entire merchant caravan's reinforcement unit had been mercilessly slaughtered. Based on the unmistakable traces and evidence left at the scene, it was effortlessly discerned that the perpetrators of this brutal attack were none other than the indigenous Jackalmen. It became apparent that the Jackalmen had been relentlessly fixated on their merchant caravan. Consequently, Highland Fortress was no longer a secure sanctuary for them either. Therefore, considering the escalating danger, I proposed that the half-elf lady should swiftly take her lightly armored mercenaries and begin their return journey immediately. If they were to travel solely with their healthy soldiers and swift warhorses, even if they were to unfortunately encounter the lurking Jackalmen, they would undoubtedly be able to easily outmaneuver and escape them. Upon hearing this suggestion, the half-elf maiden adamantly refused, her expression firm. These injured mercenaries have fought valiantly to the death for our protection, she declared, and I simply cannot bring myself to abandon them. Hearing her unwavering conviction, I decided not to press the matter any further. However, given the increasingly perilous circumstances we now faced, I brazenly made an exorbitant demand to the half-elf maiden, requesting 2,000 gold coins as a protection fee. Despite the half-elf maiden's palpable and extreme displeasure, she could do little else but reluctantly acquiesce to my terms. It was precisely at this critical juncture, however, that Hurt, the Centaur chieftain, noticed something highly unusual about the enemy's discarded weaponry. This particular spear, she pointed out, was not only of extremely crude workmanship, but its rough blade still bore noticeable unrefined traces of iron slag. Witnessing this peculiar detail, I couldn't resist forming a bold and speculative theory. Could it be, I pondered aloud, that these wretched weapons were actually forged by these damned natives themselves, half-elf lady? It was then that she proceeded to elucidate, clarifying my query. Indeed, in the untamed northern expanses of the wilderness there exist numerous tribes of immense scale and formidable power. The sheer size and organization of these grand tribes are virtually indistinguishable from small, burgeoning nations. Hence, their capability to forge and manufacture their own weaponry is not in the least bit surprising. Given this new revelation, it became starkly clear that these powerful northern tribes had also officially thrown their weight into this ongoing conflict. It would appear that this particular war is proving to be far more challenging and intricate than I had originally anticipated. Indeed, who could have ever foreseen that this seemingly helpless, innocent-looking little one was, in fact, a terrifying shaman witch capable of striking fear into the hearts of many, capable of conjuring the very wrath of the heavens with a mere flick of their wrist and incinerating every single adversary who dared to stand against them. Just moments ago, in fact, one of my subordinates frantically rushed forward to deliver an urgent report. "Boss, this is terrible news. The army of our indigenous adversaries has advanced and is now upon us. They are currently encamped at the base of the mountain, a mere 5 li outside our city walls. If no unforeseen complications arise, that is to say, they will undoubtedly reach our highland fortress by tomorrow." Upon hearing these words, a powerful surge of primal excitement, a fierce desire for battle surged within my very soul. These wretched natives have finally arrived to face their destiny, and my mighty blade has long been impatiently thirsting for this moment. As I hoisted my gleaming longsword high into the air, and issued forth a resounding command, "Brothers, charge forth, let's rip their very skulls from their bodies." Later that very evening, the Highlander barbarians, having received their orders, were the first to launch a furious charge against the enemy. Though the newly enlisted Centaur warriors still exhibited a hint of nervousness, they too quickly followed suit, their intent to kill radiating fiercely. Just then, amidst the ensuing chaos, the half-elf maiden, her face etched with profound worry, turned to me and inquired, "My lord, if I may be so bold, what exactly is your strategic battle plan? I too have undergone rigorous systematic military training, you see, so please, tell me if there is anything at all I can assist with." As I meticulously adjusted my armor, I calmly responded, "Simply follow my lead." And, in a serious tone, I continued, "First, we unleash a volley of arrows to eliminate a significant portion of their vanguard. Then, I shall personally lead the charge, engaging them in a decisive struggle. And finally, we'll simply pursue and eradicate the remaining, utterly disorganized enemies." Upon hearing this, the half-elf maiden's face took on an expression as if she had just witnessed a ghost. "Forgive me, my lord, for my limited understanding of military strategy, but please, do not deceive me. Their forces outnumber ours by more than 10 to 1. I did not bother to respond to the half-elf maiden's question. Instead, my gaze remained fixed and piercingly sharp, directly upon the evolving battlefield before us. Unlike the disorganized, headlong, brawling style of the jackal men we had previously encountered, this contingent of enemies before us was, to my surprise, roughly categorized and deployed according to their distinct troop types. At the very forefront of their formation stood several roaring Worgen cavalry, some even brandishing crude telescopes, closely followed by a distinct rank of orc infantry armed with worn and battered shields. While their appearance certainly suggested a rather destitute state, this level of organization already qualified them as a legitimate moving army. This critical observation immediately made me realize that this upcoming battle would be no trivial matter at all. I would absolutely have to commit every fiber of my being and fight with all my might. Therefore, without further delay, I took the vanguard, riding my colossal monstrous steed in hot pursuit, charging headlong into the fray. However, what proved even more devastating to the enemies than my own strategic maneuvers was the formidable prowess of the centaur's swordsmanship. Their sword strikes descended like a torrential downpour, ruthlessly harvesting the lives of their adversaries. Seeing this onslaught, the enemies across from us also mimicked our tactics and launched their own ranged attacks. But every single one was completely blocked by the colossal beast I was riding. As soldiers from both sides surged forward like two powerful converging currents, the brave warriors clashed together in a fierce embrace. Everything on the battlefield became a blur of chaotic motion, with only the soldiers' battle cries and the clang of weapons clearly audible. It was at this very moment that the ground beneath our feet suddenly began to crack and crumble without warning. In an instant, a dragon-blooded goblin, a dragon-veined goblin, burst forth from deep within the earth. Upon witnessing this astonishing sight, I immediately commanded my colossal mount to leap into the air. The gigantic beast's massive form and incredible strength sent enemies near the dragon-veined goblin scattering, and I, seizing the opportunity, descended upon it. With a single, decisive spear thrust, I swiftly claimed the dragon-veined goblin's life. The defeat and demise of the dragon-veined goblin instantly ignited a blazing fire of combat passion within the hearts of our soldiers. Every single soldier seemed to transform into a ferocious tiger, charging unstoppably towards the enemy ranks. But just as the enemies were being relentlessly beaten back by our forces, the kobold chieftain, positioned behind the enemy lines, desperate to turn the tide, surprisingly summoned a mysterious shaman, a shaman witch to unleash dark magic. This shaman witch was clad in worn, tattered beast hides, and although their face was obscured beneath a skull mask, they were gesticulating wildly and chanting incantations, clearly in the midst of casting some dark and malevolent spell. As they abruptly raised the staff held in their hand, a massive fireball suddenly erupted and shot forth from the bonfire beside them. Under the precise control of the shaman witch, this fireball instantly transformed into a fiery dragon soaring through the air. I immediately shouted out, urging my troops to exercise extreme caution, but alas, it was already a step too late. The fire dragon exploded in the very center of the battlefield with the force of 1,000 thunderbolts. I had intended to use the air gun in my hands to fend off this attack, but the powerful magic utterly obliterated my air gun, shattering it into several pieces. Fortunately, this time the enemy's primary target was me, so my barbarian subordinates only sustained minor injuries, none of which proved to be fatal. The shaman witch's fireballs posed an overwhelmingly significant threat to us. Therefore, I absolutely had to devise a strategy to eliminate them immediately. So I decisively sought out the centaur woman, Het, and instructed her to gather all the centaurs to prioritize taking down the shaman witch with their ranged attacks. With a single command from Het, all the centaurs released their bowstrings in unison, their projectiles, like streaking meteors, carved through the night sky, flying directly towards the shaman witch. However, I had not anticipated that this meticulously planned surprise attack of mine had been detected by the werewolf chieftain. As the arrows hurtled relentlessly towards the shaman witch, the werewolf chieftain's subordinates had already raised their shields high, forming an impenetrable wall to protect the shaman witch behind them. But just as the werewolf chieftain was reveling in his moment of triumph, a long spear in my hand swiftly took aim and was powerfully hurled towards the werewolf chieftain. The spear, with incredible precision, pierced straight through the werewolf chieftain's chest. The impact force of this single strike was immense. Not only did it send the werewolf chieftain flying backward, but it also severely disrupted the shaman witch behind him, who was preparing a fireball spell, causing the fireball that should have been launched at us to instantly lose all control, and instead explode directly above their own encampment. In that very instant, flames erupted and scattered everywhere, raining down like a dense and fierce firestorm upon the enemy forces, causing widespread chaos and significant casualties. The immediate and sudden reversal of the battlefield situation left the previously overconfident kobold chieftain filled with terror and unease. Therefore, he could only place his final glimmer of hope upon the shaman witch and the shaman. The witch did not disappoint him, as they once again unleashed their powerful skill. The orc warriors, who should have been severely wounded and lying incapacitated on the ground, surprisingly rose to their feet, their eyes gleaming with a bloodthirsty light, like savage wild beasts. Witnessing this astounding scene, I couldn't help but be greatly astonished. This was, astonishingly, the bloodlust art, a technique that awakens the body's latent potential. While this particular skill might not be considered a very high-level spell, its activation came with an extremely heavy price. Once unleashed upon a target, the warriors would descend into a frenzied state of relentless slaughter, until they ultimately succumbed to exhaustion and perished. Therefore, confronting such pain, ignoring killing machines head-on, engaging them in a direct, brute force confrontation was not a prudent choice. So I seized my weapon and charged directly towards the shaman witch's position. For the shaman witch was the crucial linchpin of the bloodlust art, and only by defeating them could this perilous crisis be completely averted. Yet I hadn't anticipated that as soon as the kobold chieftain spotted me, without a moment's hesitation he immediately picked up the shaman witch and fled. Seeing this, I promptly removed my helmet and flung it powerfully towards them. The shaman witch was unable to dodge in time and was directly knocked to the ground by my thrown helmet. I had initially intended to deliver a fatal blow to this wicked shaman witch, but when the shaman witch turned around, I discovered that this individual was, surprisingly, an underage female orc. This war ultimately concluded with my triumphant capture of the shaman witch, securing a resounding victory. However, many of my subordinates had sustained severe injuries during the battle, and were on the verge of losing their lives, considering that our high mountain keep did not possess a single healing priest. So, treating a desperate situation with desperate measures, I threatened the shaman witch, stating, "I command you to immediately heal my subordinates. Otherwise, I shall find some activities for your tiny physique." I originally didn't hold much hope or expectation for the shaman witch's abilities, yet the shaman witch astonishingly displayed incredible healing capabilities. Under their skillful ministrations, the warriors who were moments ago on the brink of death had their wounds miraculously heal at an astonishing rate. Considering that this witch was not only powerful in magic, but also capable of saving lives, it sparked within me the idea of recruiting them into High Mountain Keep. However, before doing so, I still needed to extract from their mouth the precise location of the shaman's stronghold. Consequently, Centaur Het, after half a day of intimidation, threats, and interrogation, was still utterly unable to glean any useful information from their mouth. With a mischievous grin, I declared, "Your methods are most certainly incorrect. I, this young master, shall personally intervene, and properly instruct you on the art of interrogation." And so, with a gentle, almost benevolent smile, I asked softly, with feigned tenderness. My dear sister, where exactly is your stronghold located? The shaman witch bared their teeth and growled, arrogantly bellowing in defiance. I am a noble witch, possessing the esteemed bloodline of a red dragon. I demand that you show me respect. But before the sister could even finish her sentence, I immediately gave them a powerful slap, which sent them flying away. What was that you just said? I didn't quite catch it clearly. At this point, the noble witch had learned their lesson, and proceeded to reveal everything about their stronghold situation, itemizing it without reservation, during which, they didn't forget to remind me to check for any omissions or deficiencies, striving to complete this task perfectly in one go. Although the witch repeatedly emphasized that all the warriors from their stronghold had already come out to participate in the battle, and only the elderly, weak, women, and children remained behind. Nevertheless, to prevent any potential resurgence on their part, I still decided to arrange for Het to go and investigate. And so, to facilitate Het in completing her mission as swiftly as possible, I directly transferred to her the upgraded coal she'd acquired in the recent battle. It then turned out that her centaur's strength and agility were impaired. During the subsequent period, free from the disturbances of local tribes, I completely dismantled the original high mountain keep and reconstructed it, transforming it into a formidable and robust fortress. Just moments ago, I encountered the half-elf woman who had departed from this place a few days prior. It turns out it was her trade caravan, preparing to transport some goods, to conduct business with the dwarven race. Upon opening and inspecting it, I discovered that the cargo loaded onto the carriage was, surprisingly, coal. It was then revealed that, ever since the dwarves discovered a new mineral vein in the sacred lake last year, they had taken up the craft of refining iron ore themselves. Consequently, their need for raw materials had dramatically surged. It was also at this critical juncture that the centaur chieftain, Het, arrived back bearing severe wounds. Having rushed back from outside, I had initially assumed that Het's injuries were sustained at the shaman's tribe, but Het instead informed me that the shaman tribe was indeed as the witch had described. Only a few elderly and vulnerable tribal members remained, and the wounds on her body were for the centaur. Upon her return, she had been attacked by other parties. I endured a significant harm caused by these bearmen. This is why only a fortunate few from the centaur squad managed to escape and return. Hearing these words, the half-elf, the young woman looked quite dejected and disheartened. It seems that traveling to the dwarven tribe is now out of the question. I looked at the unfortunate young woman and offered some words of comfort. Since you are unable to conduct business with the dwarven race, why don't you consider simply giving these coal mines over to me? Upon hearing these words, the young woman wore a completely bewildered expression. What possible use could you have for all these coal mines, I wonder? I offered no immediate reply to the young woman's question. Instead, I led her straight into my private armory, a place of my own making. The young woman was absolutely stunned upon seeing the centaurs diligently forging iron implements. Is it possible that the Lord has been continuously crafting his own unique armaments all this time? I offered a subtle, enigmatic smile, then turned to Ganther and inquired, has the secret weapon I meticulously designed been successfully completed? Ganther gestured towards a mysterious object shrouded in a crimson cloth and responded, My lord, it has been fully constructed precisely according to your intricate design. Then, under the absolutely bewildered and wide-eyed gaze of the half-elf maiden, I slowly and deliberately unveiled the crimson cloth that shrouded the mysterious weapon. However, I certainly never anticipated that. Before I even had the chance to demonstrate the devastating power of the Italian cannon, a foolish group of reckless bearmen would dare to provoke and challenge me directly, wounding a group of my centaur scouts whom I had dispatched to gather intelligence on the enemy's movements. Therefore, in order to exact swift retribution and honor for my brave centaurs, I resolved to take my freshly constructed Italian cannon and confront the bearmen, settling this matter decisively. From the half-elf maiden, who maintains a strong rapport with the dwarven race, I learned from her that the bearmen's army, in their current southward advance, most certainly has set its greedy sights upon the precious iron mines of the dwarves. After all, in this era of constant strife and cold steel weaponry, where conflicts rage endlessly, whoever manages to possess abundant resources will undoubtedly command absolute and decisive initiative in all affairs. As I absorbed this crucial information, I instantly had a rather wicked and cunning thought immediately surface in my mind. We could absolutely position ourselves as a stick in the mud, cleverly interfering in the war between the bearmen and dwarves. In this manner, we would not only be able to effectively teach the bearmen a much-needed lesson, but also forge a strong and mutually beneficial strategic partnership with the dwarves, who possess valuable iron ore resources. On that very same night, as darkness descended, our entire party quietly made our presence known in the immediate vicinity of the dwarven castle. However, what truly perplexed and bewildered me was this. Even though it was unequivocally the bearmen who were engaged in conflict with the dwarven race, why was it a group of rabbit men launching a night raid on the dwarven castle this evening? The half-elf maiden then carefully explained to me, these rabbit men are, in fact, loyal vassals and subservient allies of the bearmen. Powerful races such as the bearmen typically take on a number of weaker, more subservient groups to handle menial tasks and various chores. And, moreover, during times of warfare, they can readily be sent forward to serve as expendable cannon fodder. Even as she spoke these words, several of the leading rabbit men had already successfully scaled the fortress walls. Yet the dwarven soldiers, still deeply immersed in their peaceful slumber, had not yet detected any sign of their presence, completely oblivious to their own grave negligence, thus affording the cunning rabbit men an absolutely flawless opportunity for a surprise ambush. The rabbit men positioned below the city walls, observing their companions' successful surprise attack from above, immediately initiated a full-scale, coordinated assault upon the dwarven castle's defenses. It was only at this precise moment that the dwarven soldiers finally became aware of the unusual activity unfolding outside, and hastily began to draw back the strings of their powerful long crossbows, preparing to unleash a fierce and immediate counterattack. Nevertheless, by then, tragically, it was already far too late for any effective defense. At this very moment, the rabbitmen's army had already surged forward, reaching the very threshold of the city gates. Yet, just as the rabbitmen's leader was smugly convinced that victory was firmly within his grasp, a devastating cannonball suddenly descended with furious velocity from the heavens, exploding with destructive force right amidst the densely packed ranks of the rabbitmen army. I gazed with an undeniable smirk of triumph at the immense destructive power unleashed by the Italian cannon. With such a formidable divine weapon now firmly within my grasp, who else on this battlefield could possibly stand as my true opponent? Even though the rabbitmen's leader presented a rather unintelligent demeanor, he still grasped the dire reality of being caught in a pincer movement, attacked from both front and rear, which was an incredibly disadvantageous turn of events in warfare. Consequently, he, in a fit of desperate frustration, immediately issued the command to have his entire rabbit army swiftly turn around and launch an immediate counterattack. Confronted with these expendable cannon fodder troops, whose combat effectiveness was notably limited, these rabbit men, my formidable barbarian army quickly demonstrated an overwhelming and undeniable advantage. Thus, this engagement, which truly held no discernible suspense, very swiftly devolved into an utterly one-sided and brutal massacre. In merely a few fleeting moments, the entire rabbitmen army was utterly annihilated and massacred under the relentless and fierce onslaught of my barbarian forces. Yet, at this very precise juncture, the very ground beneath us suddenly began to vibrate with an intense and violent tremor. I instinctively turned around with a keen sense of curiosity to observe, only to discover a colossal, imposing figure had menacingly appeared directly behind me, a thunderous roar, reverberating with furious power that echoed across the vast sky, emanated from his massive maw. The bearmen tribe, who had been stealthily observing from the shadows, had finally been provoked enough to unleash their formidable strength and make their move. The ferocious and utterly brutal bear-man warrior, as soon as he manifested himself, immediately began to powerfully brandish his formidable meteor hammer. Launching a swift and aggressive assault directly upon me, I reacted almost purely on instinct, with barely a moment's thought, attempting to brace my sword horizontally across my chest in a desperate defensive block, but was violently propelled backward by the sheer, overwhelming force of the impact, sent flying. An excruciating wave of intense pain instantly coursed and spread throughout my entire body, as though it sought to utterly rip my very being asunder, tearing me into pieces. It is quite clear that the formidable strength of this particular bearman warrior vastly surpasses my own. Concurrently, at that very moment, the main contingent of the bearman's army also surged onto the chaotic battlefield, leading their revitalized rabbit army in a ferocious, full frontal assault directly towards our position. My loyal centaur warriors, observing this dire development, each of them promptly tightened the strings of their longbows, preparing their weapons, then immediately launched a devastating barrage of long-range attacks upon the advancing enemy. The sharp, piercing whistling of countless arrows reverberated menacingly through the air, and each devastating impact was met with the agonizing groans and desperate screams of the enemy. I had initially believed that we had successfully seized control and command of the entire battle situation, yet I never could have imagined that the enemy possessed such a staggering numerical advantage. Vast numbers of reserve troops were continuously pouring forth, steadily joining the fray on the battlefield. It was precisely at this critical juncture that our brave little Lolly, holding a vibrant fireball, stepped forward with an air of absolute confidence and resolve. It appears that this old gal will still have to personally intervene in this matter. As she vigorously raised her magical staff high into the air, the fireball, which had initially been merely the size of her palm, rapidly expanded in mid-air with astonishing speed, until it had grown so immense it almost completely obscured half of the entire sky above us. The very next instant, the colossal fireball, resembling a blazing meteor, tore powerfully across the vast expanse of the sky, hurtling with immense destructive force directly towards the heart of the enemy's formations, instantly and completely engulfing the enemy's entire main force within an infernal raging sea of fire. However, even though the fireball spell had undeniably displayed such astonishing and devastating power, I still did not dare to allow myself to become complacent or lower my guard, for I was acutely aware that while a fiery projectile like this would prove absolutely lethal to the rabbitmen cannon fodder, it would, unfortunately, be quite incapable of inflicting any truly substantial or meaningful damage upon the thick-skinned and heavily muscled bearmen. Therefore, I decisively summoned forth the system's interface, and rushed forward, immediately utilizing the formidable power of the steel firmaments to cleave the towering bear man in two with a single powerful sword stroke. However, lacking the assistance of such a powerful system, my venerable Ganther was not quite so fortunate in his encounter, and was directly swatted away, sent violently flying by a single powerful palm strike from the bear man. The enraged Roselle then hurled his axe with considerable force, intending to held Ganther by a precious moment of time. However, the axe merely left a shallow and insignificant scratch upon the bear man's incredibly thick hide. It regrettably failed to inflict the immense damage that I had anticipated. The now utterly enraged bear man let loose a guttural and menacing growl. He then lunged once more, directly towards the already severely wounded and almost lifeless Ganther. Just as it seemed, Ganther was inevitably about to be utterly annihilated by the relentless bear man, a brilliant, dazzling flash of swordlight suddenly pierced through the very air, and with the speed of lightning, too swift to even perceive, it cleanly severed the bear man's massive head. And the precise reason I was able to execute this particular technique with such remarkable fluidity and success was largely thanks to the incredibly gifted and exceptionally clever Big Smarty, and the invisibility spell that he had only recently mastered. This incredible skill of his could not only be effectively employed upon himself, but could also be strategically bestowed upon allied forces as well. As a direct consequence, we hadn't even had the opportunity to begin celebrating our hard-won triumph, when I was utterly shocked to discover that, upon the fallen corpses of the enemy warriors, they were all inexplicably enveloped within a swirling reddish mist. The very next instant, the bearmen and rabbitmen who had previously been gravely wounded and fallen to the ground eerily and unnaturally rose back to their feet. Our little loli immediately recognized with a single discerning glance that this was undoubtedly the unique and distinctive skill of a Minotaur shaman, a terrifying technique known as Berserk Frenzy. However, after I meticulously searched all around the immediate area, I was unable to locate the specific Minotaur shaman responsible for casting this spell anywhere nearby. The little lolly then, with a noticeably grave and solemn expression, proceeded to explain to me that this particular Berserk Frenzy had been cast remotely by our adversaries, which meant that the enemy forces currently present were merely in a state of partial frenzy. Upon hearing this crucial piece of information, I immediately felt a noticeable sense of relief wash over me, allowing me to slightly relax. If that is truly the situation, then I genuinely have absolutely nothing left to be concerned about, because these scattered remnants of their forces are utterly no match for Ganther and his formidable companions. Our decisive action in assisting the dwarven race to successfully repel the encroaching bearmen tribe was instantly met with an overwhelmingly enthusiastic and gracious welcome from the appreciative dwarven people. However, just as I was preparing to retreat to my room for some much-needed rest and recuperation, the dwarven castle suddenly began to violently shake and tremble, entirely without any prior warning or indication. I hastily rose from my bed, and urgently glanced out through the window, only to discover that the bearmen warriors, accompanied by their cunning Minotaur shaman, had returned, and were now charging back to attack. This was due to our seemingly effortless victory over the bearmen not too long ago, which had unfortunately created a false impression in these not-so-bright dwarves, leading them to mistakenly believe they held the clear upper hand. So, eager to display their prowess, their leader grandly waved his hand, and then, with an air of absolute self-assurance, declared to me, "You all will not need to participate in this particular battle. I shall personally demonstrate to you the formidable and robust might of our dwarven warriors." As the dwarves sounded their sharp, battle-ready horns for the offensive, the dwarven army, in their desperate eagerness to prove themselves, aggressively charged forward with overwhelming momentum. Nevertheless, their inherent impulsiveness and deeply ingrained overconfidence instead caused them to become deeply entangled in a perilous predicament. In this engagement characterized by such a significant power disparity, the dwarves appeared utterly overwhelmed and profoundly outmatched, fundamentally incapable of withstanding the relentless and ferocious offensive launched by the formidable bearmen. Upon witnessing this unfolding situation, the dwarf chieftain was utterly consumed by panic. He immediately commanded his subordinates to launch giant, powerful siege crossbows, providing crucial support for the main forces fighting at the front. Despite the precise, concentrated volleys from the siege crossbows, managing to successfully fell several of the fierce bearmen, the loss of his comrades in arms absolutely enraged the Minotaur shaman stationed at the enemy's rear. In an instant, the Minotaur shaman's eyes visibly and rapidly became engorged with blood, flaring a furious crimson red, radiating an overwhelmingly savage and bloodthirsty intent to kill. Witnessing this terrifying spectacle, the dwarf chieftain's heart turned to ashes with despair. "It's completely over for us. We're utterly finished now. The Minotaur shaman has truly descended into a full, uncontrollable frenzy." Even Gunther, who typically held me in unquestioning blind adoration, couldn't resist speaking up and posing a question. "Boss, this frenzied riding skills has amplified the Minotaur shaman's physique to its absolute ultimate limit. Is there truly any possible way left for us to secure a victory?" I found myself with no available time to respond to Gunther's urgent question. Instead, with a visibly displeased expression, I abruptly posed my own question. "Exactly where has our own shaman witch disappeared to?" As it turned out, the little Lolai, at the very first sight of the Minotaur shaman, had instinctively chosen to flee the battle. However, she was unfortunately caught completely off guard and apprehended by the Highland barbarians. Filled with profound disappointment and frustration, I firmly grabbed the little Loli by her collar. With such a formidable adversary currently raging before us, you actually chose to desert your post and flee the battlefield in the face of danger? You have completely disgraced the honor of our entire High Mountain Treasure clan. Even if the Minotaur shaman possesses the formidable frenzied riding skill, don't you yourself also wield the powerful bloodlust riding skill? What in the world are you so utterly terrified of then? Upon hearing these words, the dwarf chieftain was instantly overcome with a surge of excitement, clasping his hands tightly in anticipation. This was because the bloodlust riding skill stood as a formidable amplification ability, in no way inferior to the frenzied riding skill. If the little lolly were truly able to unleash the full, inherent power of her bloodlust riding skill, then they might just grasp a faint, elusive glimmer of hope for survival. However, the subsequent outcome, the specific words that I uttered immediately afterward, managed to utterly shock both the little lolly and the dwarf chieftain simultaneously, leaving them stunned for a full 2.5 seconds. With what I personally felt was a rather dashing gesture, I pointed straight ahead and issued a definitive command to the little lolly. I command you to immediately cast the bloodlust skill upon the enemy's Minotaur shaman. Activate the bloodlust art, little lolly, even though she believes my order was nothing short of an absolute death wish, to bestow an additional buff upon an already frenzied Minotaur shaman, enhancing his battle capabilities with the bloodlust art. Wouldn't this simply make our adversary even more overwhelmingly powerful? She surely thought. Nevertheless, compelled by my undeniable authority and presence, the little lolly could do nothing but obediently retrieve her magical staff, and, with trembling hands, began to recite the ancient incantation. In the very next fleeting instant, the Minotaur shaman, now fully empowered by the potent augmentation of bloodlust riding skill, instantly mutated into a truly ferocious, uncontrollable entity, resembling an immensely powerful, rampaging god of war. The veins and blood vessels on his colossal body surface began to visibly bulge and swell, much like thick, gnarled tree roots. An immense, surging torrent of power instantly coursed through him, appearing as though it might rupture his very skin at any given moment. The dwarf people could no longer suppress the overwhelming fear gripping their hearts, and, in a collective panic, they hastily cast aside their weapons, turning their backs without a second thought and bolting away in terror. At this point, the little lolai was absolutely convinced that they were undoubtedly on the verge of being utterly annihilated, their entire force wiped out, and she began scrambling to prepare to follow the fleeing dwarves, desperate to escape herself. Yet, with a speed that defied the blink of an eye, I swiftly snatched her and pulled her firmly back. What in the world are you panicking so frantically about? Open your eyes wide and pay very close attention to what's happening. But at this precise moment, although the Minotaur shaman's formidable muscles had indeed swollen to an exaggerated and truly terrifying size, his physical body suddenly began to stiffen and become rigid piece by piece. It became clear that his own body was fundamentally refusing to obey his commands. As it turned out, the more colossal a creature's physical size, the greater the immense strain placed upon its heart, especially when undergoing berserker transformations. Although both the frenzied riding skill and the bloodlust riding skill undeniably offer remarkably potent effects, they invariably place an even more severe and dangerous burden on the individual's heart. And once these accumulated burdens completely surpass the absolute limits of what the Minotaur shaman's body could physically endure, his entire physical form would instantaneously collapse in on itself. And then, as everyone watched with expressions of utter disbelief plastered across their faces, the Minotaur shaman's chest suddenly ruptured, violently gushing forth an immense quantity of blood. His colossal frame swayed precariously for a few moments, before his entire body abruptly toppled backward and crashed heavily onto the ground, having completely and utterly lost all signs of life. Both the bearman and the Minotaur shaman were truly considered paramount, dominant forces within these desolate wilderness lands. They had been consecutively recognized and encountered within the brief span of a single day, therefore the other bandits and marauders lurking within the wilderness. However, as long as the vital iron mine, even for a single day, remained firmly within the possession of the dwarf clan, the various marauding wilderness bandits would certainly not relinquish their claims so easily or without a fight. Consequently, I directly approached the dwarf clan chieftain and put forth a particularly clever and cunning strategy for them to consider, suggesting that they could initially relinquish control of Bayou Lake, the location of the precious iron mine, and then patiently wait for these rival wilderness bandits to fiercely contend and squabble amongst themselves until they were significantly weakened and suffered heavy losses, at which point we could then decisively return and reclaim it. To my utter surprise, however, the tactical plan I had carefully presented was unhesitatingly and instantly rejected by the dwarf chieftain right on the spot. This was because, hidden deep beneath the waters of Bayou Lake, there lay an object of far greater significance and value than mere iron ore, something that the entire dwarf clan was bound to protect at all costs. Before long, I was led by the dwarf chieftain as we descended and successfully reached the very bottom of Bayou Lake. After carefully navigating through a narrow crevice, barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through, I was confronted with an absolutely astonishing sight that filled me with profound shock and awe. Deep within the seemingly eternal passage, there lay a colossal Titan giant, eerily bound and enveloped by thick, heavy iron chains. And what was more, this ancient Titan giant's eyes would, in response to our cautious approach, begin to emit an ominous, pulsating red glow. Once our entire party had safely returned to the dry land of the shore, it was then that the dwarf chieftain, with a distinct expression of profound pride, began to elaborate and explain to me the fundamental reason why they were so fiercely determined to protect this particular Titan giant, even to their deaths, was precisely because this was no mere ordinary Titan giant. Rather, it was the revered ancestor of their entire dwarf race. Upon hearing this astonishing revelation, I was left with a completely bewildered and utterly confused expression on my face. How on earth could a colossal, giant-like Titan possibly sire such remarkably short and diminutive descendants? At this rate, even Darwin's coffin lid wouldn't be able to stay closed, defying all logic. The dwarf chieftain, observing my disbelief, that I was clearly not convinced by his explanation, without a moment of hesitation, promptly leapt back into the depths of Bayou Lake. In the very next instant that followed, the previously clear and transparent lake surface began to inexplicably emit an eerie and unsettling red glow. It was then that the dwarf chieftain resumed his explanation, clarifying to me, this vibrant red light is, in fact, the raw soul power emanating from the Titan giant, and it only truly begins to glow when it perceives the close proximity of its own direct bloodline. Hearing this additional piece of information, I found myself even more perplexed and full of questions. Given that this particular Titan giant holds such immense importance for your people, then why haven't you simply excavated him and relocated him elsewhere? The dwarf chieftain ran a hand across his head, wearing an expression of utter helplessness and resignation. They had indeed attempted precisely that course of action in the past, but as they continued their efforts to excavate the area, the crimson glow emanating from the iron mine Titan giant gradually grew weaker and progressively dimmer. It was only much later that they finally made a crucial discovery, that the natural lodestones embedded within the iron ore here had fortuitously created a unique and powerful magnetic field, effectively binding the Titan giant's most fundamental soul essence, the very last vestiges of its life force, securely within its eye sockets. So, you can't possibly intend to perpetually guard this Titan until your dying breath, can you? While I certainly understood and appreciated the profound sense of mission held by the dwarves, I simply could not resist posing a further question. Dwarf chieftain? The chieftain, upon hearing my inquiry, immediately proceeded to clarify and explain to me, according to the detailed ancient texts and records they had meticulously consulted, they had discovered that the immense soul power of the Titan could, in fact, be successfully inherited by a worthy successor. Furthermore, it was stated that during the auspicious time of the full moon, the inherent power of the soul force would become even more potent and formidable than at any other moment. Presently, there are still 2 full days remaining until the upcoming night of the nearest full moon, and so they have resolved, by any means necessary, to hold their ground and steadfastly defend until that precise moment. Upon hearing these words at that specific moment, a deeply greedy and ambitious thought instantly sparked within the hidden depths of my mind. However, I ultimately shook my head in reluctant resignation, then offered a wry, bitter smile. Aren't you concerned that by revealing all of this to me, you might tempt me with its power? The dwarf chieftain fixed his unwavering gaze directly upon my eyes, and with an utterly serious and solemn expression he responded, this profound and ancient soul power, it is perhaps the very last remaining glorious legacy of our dwarf ancestral Titan. More than it potentially falling into your possession, what we fear even more profoundly is the possibility that no one will successfully manage to inherit it at all, leaving it eternally sealed away in this sunless, accursed place, never to see the light of day again. Furthermore, we have already deliberated extensively on this matter amongst ourselves. If our chosen dwarf warriors prove unable to achieve success in this endeavor, then we would humbly request that you attempt to intervene and give it a try. Who could have possibly imagined that this immense, ancient Titan giant which had lain deceased for tens of thousands of years directly before my eyes, would still possess such a colossal and majestic reserve of soul power lingering within its very core? And what was even more remarkably outlandish and beyond belief, was that this entire group of physically diminutive dwarves, audacious, claimed to be the direct descendants of this very same ancient Titan giant. And furthermore, they harbored the intention of attempting to inherit the ancient Titan's terrifying and enigmatic soul power on the approaching night of the full moon. I was inherently quite skeptical regarding any claims of being able to directly inherit such immense powers, especially after observing the dwarf chieftain performing what he termed a bad luck banishing rituals with gestures akin to idly shooing away bothersome flies. I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense that my presence here in the dead of night, specifically to participate in this ritual, was proving to be an utter and complete waste of my valuable time. However, the little loli, her face etched with a look of defiance, proceeded to argue back with me. According to ancient legends, their shamans possess a sacred empowerment secret art, which enables them to flawlessly transfer the accumulated lifelong experiences of an elder shaman directly to the succeeding generation. Upon hearing these particular words, I grew even more firmly convinced that any assertions about inheriting power in such a manner were utterly untrustworthy and improbable. If such an incredibly potent and amazing secret art truly existed, then their shamans would surely not be so utterly suppressed and overshadowed by mages that they couldn't even hold their heads high. As one of the dwarf elders vigorously blew a resounding blast on his ancient horn, the 5 carefully selected dwarf inheritors stood solemnly before the Titan's ancient remains, positioned not far away, forming a solemn line before a designated circle of sacred fire. Then, one by one, they would sequentially step into the fiery circle, dropping to a single knee, and bowing deeply in a gesture of reverence, their faces filled with piety as they invoked the Titans through their very bloodline. A worried expression on my face, I quietly murmured to the little loli, "Could there possibly be any danger involved in this ritual?" The little lolly responded with a mischievous grin and a slight nod. If a dwarf's small frame can't handle the massive spiritual essence of a Titan, then their body might just explode right there on the spot. It's certainly a possibility. Upon hearing her words, I subtly and discreetly shifted a few steps backward, feigning indifference, only to discover that my concerns were entirely unfounded in the end. As the dwarven successors came and went in a constant procession like a revolving lantern, each one trying their luck, only to yield the same result, the Titan's remains showed not even the slightest ripple of fluctuation, offering absolutely no sign or hint of a response. Witnessing this disheartening scene, the dwarven chieftain instantly crumbled. He immediately sank to the ground, utterly powerless, and began to weep uncontrollably, his voice breaking with anguish, completely devoid of the usual dignity and authority he commanded. Then, clinging to that very last thread of desperate hope, he turned to me and suggested, "My lord of High Mountain Hold, perhaps you would be willing to step forward and give it a try?" My initial impulse was to outright decline the offer, but when I saw all the dwarves present, their gazes fixed upon me as if I were their final, desperate hope, staring intensely in my direction, I felt compelled to go up and make a show of trying, pretending to give it my best effort. After all, I am a pure-blooded human, completely unrelated to Titans. Humans and Titans don't share even a remote drop of blood. If even the dwarves couldn't succeed, then I would undoubtedly fail even more spectacularly. Therefore, mimicking the dwarves' actions, I stepped into the fiery circle, and somewhat nonchalantly struck the pose for summoning the Titan. Yet, in the very next instant, the fiery circle beneath my feet suddenly erupted with a blinding, dazzling light, and the colossal remains of the Titan giant, for the first time this night, slowly opened its ancient eyes. Those eyes now burning with an intense, fiery crimson glow, emitting a terrifying, heart-pounding aura that filled the air. Following that, everyone present distinctly heard a sound akin to the shattering of delicate glass, as if some truly dreadful entity was on the verge of violently erupting from within the Titan's very eyeball. Witnessing this alarming development, I quickly shouted out loudly, urging them to awaken. "Everyone, run now. It looks like this thing is about to violently explode." However, the dwarves present utterly disregarded my warning, showing no appreciation whatsoever, each one behaving as if completely mesmerized, their eyes fixed on the Titan's remains with a fervent, almost maniacal intensity. Fortunately, the Titan's eyeball did not, in fact, truly explode as I had feared. After that distinct sound of shattering glass subsided, the Titan giant's eyes slowly but surely returned to a state of calm. It was at this moment that we finally noticed that the Titan giant's eyeball had a massive hole ruptured into its surface, and a peculiar-looking small creature was wriggling its way out from within. Witnessing this astounding sight, I was utterly and boldly taken aback. This event would surely cause Darwin's coffin lid to burst wide open, completely unable to contain him. I couldn't help but wonder if some sow had strayed from the path, or if a fox had managed to somehow elope with a Titan giant. For the Titan giant, over an immense span of time, had somehow conceived and given birth to this tiny creature. Yet, it was precisely this odd-looking, diminutive monster that caused all the dwarves present to instantly erupt into a frenzy of excitement and commotion. They rapidly swarmed and gathered directly beneath the Titan's remains, making a great clamor, terrified that their precious little ancestor might plummet to the ground. Nevertheless, this little creature, however, seemed quite unwilling to remain still, much like a lively monkey, leaping and scrambling all over the colossal remains of the Titan giant. At last, with a sudden, powerful spring, this small creature soared into the air and gracefully descended, landing with surprising lightness upon the finger of the large, simple-minded fellow. While this tiny creature was undoubtedly a priceless treasure in the eyes of the entire dwarven race, they were terrified that it might suffer even the slightest bit of harm. However, I certainly wasn't going to pamper it. I abruptly extended my arm and quickly snatched it right into my hand. I noticed that this small creature possessed a thin membrane stretching between its limbs and its abdomen. This was likely the very reason it was capable of gliding through the air. The surrounding dwarves, witnessing this action, immediately crowded around me, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of intense curiosity and desperate longing. "Quickly, let me touch it for a moment." It was at this very opportune moment that the tiny creature in my hand began to let out pained yelps, its face contorted in agony. I instantly realized that the situation had taken a decidedly bad turn, so, much like passing a hot ball, I quickly tossed the small creature backward into the waiting arms of a dwarf, and immediately thereafter an enormous thunderous boom echoed through the chamber. The dwarves were collectively singed, their hair transforming into the wildly popular explosion hairstyle of recent times. At this point I was absolutely certain that this tiny creature was indeed the genuine offspring of a titan, since it had apparently inherited the titan's formidable thunder magic. It was also at this precise moment that the dwarven chieftain suddenly let out a resounding cry, pointing a trembling finger towards the titan's remains. "Look everyone, look at the titan giant." The entire gathering of dwarves uniformly turned their heads to gaze in that direction, only to discover that the titan's colossal remains were undeniably and irresistibly diminishing, slowly crumbling away bit by bit. Though the dwarves were overwhelmed with profound grief, some even had tears welling up and reddening their eyes, as they openly wept. Yet, they understood that this signified the titan's ultimate mission had finally been fulfilled, and it could at last return to dust. Its long journey concluded. Early the very next morning, our small group embarked upon the return journey, heading back towards High Mountain Hold. The half-elf maiden, however, expressed considerable dissatisfaction with my sudden decision. "Why are we rushing back to High Mountain Hold at such an early hour? We should have finalized our cooperation agreement with the dwarves before departing. After all, we are currently hailed as the saviors of the entire dwarven tribe, and everything's much easier to negotiate right now. In the future, it's quite probable that the dwarves might renege on their word and refuse to acknowledge our efforts." Cradling the small creature, I calmly replied, "You really don't need to trouble yourself with such worries. As long as this little creature remains in my care for even a single day, whatever words I utter, the dwarves will uphold them as if they were sacred imperial decrees." It turns out the dwarves had originally intended to revere and raise him themselves, but as soon as he was separated from me, this little fellow instantly became utterly listless and forlorn. Losing all his usual energy and spirit, he didn't even have the heart to eat his meals, poor dwarf. The dwarves, left with no alternative, had no choice but to hand him over to me for adoption and care. Because the small creature constantly emitted a distinctive kichu sound, I decided to rename him Chichu to reflect this unique trait. In this manner then, after several days of a relaxed and unhurried journey, our party successfully made it back to High Mountain Hold. Shortly thereafter, Annie, along with her merchant caravan, also parted ways with us, promising to return with more people as swiftly as she could. Consequently, for the duration of the subsequent period, I enjoyed a remarkably rare and exceptionally comfortable little life. By the time Annie once again arrived at High Mountain Hold with her merchant caravan, it was already more than 10 days later than our initial parting. Yet at this specific moment, the sheer transformation of High Mountain Hold left Annie utterly astonished, prompting her to bombard me with questions. Why have the dwarves from the dwarven tribe so willingly become my personal, exclusive blacksmiths? And why, when you, the lord, are simply basking in the sunlight, do you require a full half-dozen rabbit-headed and goat-headed maidens diligently fanning you by your side? Hearing her pointed questions, I awkwardly adjusted my sunglasses, a slight flush creeping up my neck. The ongoing warfare within the dwarven tribe has led to them almost losing everything they owned, rendering them unable to sustain their livelihoods there any longer. So, for them to come and simply join me here to live out their days is a perfectly reasonable arrangement, wouldn't you agree? As for these utterly defenseless young girls, every single one of them, due to the ravages of war, lost the protective embrace of their tribes, and voluntarily came to seek refuge and protection within High Mountain Hold. Am I truly wrong for simply wanting to provide each and every one of them with a safe home? Despite my utterly serious and profound nonsensical explanations, Annie, predictably, refused to believe a single word of it. However, her true purpose for this visit to High Mountain Hold was not to pry into my private affairs, but rather to introduce me to a renowned and respected naturalist. After the individual politely removed their hat, I was utterly astounded to discover that this white tiger-headed person known as Buckland was, in fact, a female tiger. My given name is Tang. So, Lord, you may simply call me Tan Baihu. I have come here because I hope to conduct some research concerning the wilderness here in High Mountain Hold. After introducing herself, Buckland innocently blinked her eyes several times, appearing quite bewildered. She couldn't fathom why the Lord had suddenly adopted an expression of barely suppressed laughter. Was the name Tan Baihu truly that amusing, she seemed to wonder? It was at this very opportune moment that the arrival of a rabbit person sentinel broke the tense, awkward silence. Apparently, several lizardmen had arrived from outside the city walls, desiring an audience to pay their respects to me, the esteemed lord of High Mountain Hold. I pulled out my trusty telescope and took a good look, only to discover that these so-called lizardmen were merely a group of scrawny, diminutive individuals who appeared utterly devoid of any real combat capability. Therefore, with an expression of clear disdain, I casually instructed my subordinates should simply turn them away. There's no need for me to meet them. However, Tan Baihu then informed me they are not just any ordinary lizardmen, but specifically they are Skagal lizardmen. Their ultimate destination on this journey is likely to pledge allegiance to Pompey. Emperor Sagre, in his passage through High Mountain Hold, wished to first establish contact with the local nobility, such as yourself, to ensure no embarrassing misunderstandings or blunders occur later. Upon hearing her words, my face adopted a thoroughly bewildered expression. Doesn't our esteemed emperor exclusively seek to conquer and dominate powerful races? What possible connection could there be between him and this group who clearly possess no discernible combat prowess? These feeble lizard men? Annie cast a dismissive glance in my direction, and spoke with an exasperated, utterly speechless tone. You absolutely must not underestimate them. The Skagal people also go by the moniker of dragon tamers. The moment these words were uttered, my mouth dropped open in such profound shock that it felt as though an entire watermelon could easily fit inside. Now, don't get so overly excited just yet. Annie, it seemed, also understood that what she had just said could very easily stir up considerable controversy. Of course, they couldn't possibly be actual giant dragons, but rather a type of terrain dragon known as the Skagal grassland dragon. I patted my chest to calm my racing heart. You should have said something sooner. After all this fuss, it turns out they were just imitations. Then, with a casual air, I continued asking, how large is that terrain dragon you spoke of? Buckland deliberately adjusted his spectacles. A faint trace of blood appeared on his aged face. It's only slightly smaller than your mounted knights, and your iron ballfish, just a bit. Furthermore, they possess a natural kicking foot structure, making them exceptionally adept at charging. Before Buckland could finish his sentence, I excitedly crumpled the tin-made telescope in my hand into a twisted mess. Quickly carry them into High Mountain Fortress in grand style, like royalty. Subordinates who willingly present themselves like this, I absolutely must keep them here permanently. Who could have ever imagined that this group of seemingly powerless lizard men were beings even the Emperor himself desperately sought to recruit? This is because every scale lizard man is born alongside a grassland terrain dragon. This intimate, blood-bound relationship fosters unconditional trust between the lizard men and their dragons, allowing for perfectly seamless coordination, thereby fully unleashing the terrifying charging power of the dragons. Therefore, upon hearing that the lizard men intended to visit High Mountain Fortress, I immediately instructed my subordinates to escort them in with the utmost fanfare. This overlord dragon group that willingly arrives at our doorstep, I am determined to find a way to keep them here at High Mountain Fortress permanently. However, Mother Tiger for Mother 2Dox, and Buckland believed I was merely daydreaming. After all, when trying to recruit someone, there's no logical reason for them to pass up a king, and instead choose me, an untested pioneer lord with an uncertain future. To Buckland's immense surprise, it only took mere moments. A few scale lizardmen cheerfully extended their hands to shake mine. It didn't feel like I, the Lord of High Mountain Fortress, was painstakingly trying to recruit them, but rather as if they were gladly pledging their loyalty to High Mountain Fortress, and were fortunate enough to be accepted. The leading scale lizardman, sporting a rather obsequious expression, then added that he would immediately return to bring his entire clan over. What kind of bewitching potion did you feed them? Buckland, knowing the reason, felt compelled to ask, unable to contain his curiosity. He simply had to ask. Upon hearing this, I let out a proud grin. Naturally, it was my commanding aura that utterly captivated them. Under my formidable regal aura, he had developed a complete immunity to my earnest yet nonsensical ramblings. Buckland found it impossible to believe. He simply refused to believe it under any circumstances. The actual reason I managed to persuade the scale lizardmen so swiftly was due to a power-boosting item within my strongest lord system. I promised them that if they were willing to join my ranks, each one would receive one. Upon hearing about this incredible opportunity, they eagerly stayed without a second thought. Thus, after striking a deal with the scale lizardmen, I pulled up a small stool and began a game of fight the landlord with Big Fool and Second Fool. Before long, I suddenly noticed the water glass on the table start to tremble faintly. Chichu, thinking an earthquake had struck, curled into a ball as if terrified, but I rose to my feet with great excitement, because I knew full well this was undoubtedly the arrival of my ultimate overlord dragon troop. Although I had been anticipating this, when I truly witnessed the Skull Terrain dragons charging with unparalleled might and commanding presence, thundering towards High Mountain Fortress, I finally understood the true meaning of innate heavy cavalry. Annie remarked with a touch of regret after witnessing this. It's a shame the four beasts are still too weak. It would be much better if they could be replaced by more powerful knights. I immediately scoffed at Annie's amateurish notion. The most crucial aspect for cavalry is their sheer charging impact. A knight's weapon is far less important than their riding skill. If it were different riders, how could they possibly achieve the trust born from blood connection? With the integration of this cavalry unit, the roster of the High Mountain Defense Force expanded considerably. The Highland Barbarians formed the largest contingent, numbering nearly 200, followed by the four beasts, the beasts, numbering around 80 as well. However, this was still more than double the Centaur force, which was less than 40, indeed, more than double their number. Adding the spellcasting team formed by Little Lowly, Big Fool, and Second Fool, my total subordinate count now exceeded 300. If warriors were required for High Mountain Fortress, we could also summon an equal number of werewolf and dwarf militia to assist, making our combat strength quite respectable. Therefore, I had become the most invincible force in the entire High Mountain Fortress region, making further subordinate recruitment largely insignificant. Consequently, I redirected my focus towards enhancing my personal strength. For no matter how powerful my subordinates are, personal strength is always more beneficial. The resourceful Buckland suggested I cultivate the Sacred Rock Island arts, a suggestion I refused outright without a second thought. The Sacred Rock Island arts were merely an outdated, rudimentary technique solely focused on increasing raw power, and I already possessed a single punch capable of delivering over 2 tons of force, so there was absolutely no need to waste time practicing the Sacred Eye Guiding technique. It was awesome combat energy and magic that truly captured my interest. However, Buckland informed me that secret arts are neither inherently good nor bad, only suitability or unsuitability, and he believed the Sacred Flame arts were the most fitting technique for me to cultivate at this time, solely because the Sacred Rock Guiding technique amplifies strengths proportionally. Upon hearing this, I became so excited that I nearly overturned the table. Isn't this the legendary concept of the strong grow stronger and the weak grow weaker? Immediately thereafter, Buckland produced the yellowed, aged sheepskin scroll from his pocket and said, I happen to possess the first stage cultivation manual for the Sacred Rock Arts. I am willing to bestow this cultivation manual upon you, my lord, provided you are willing to grant me a small favor in return, which is to appoint me as High Mountain Fortress's Minister of Internal Affairs. Upon hearing this, without giving it a second thought, I readily agreed, as I was acutely aware that High Mountain Fortress currently had almost no actual internal affairs to manage. The administration of the territory was hardly more sophisticated than thugs extorting protection money, while my subordinates were each fiercer than the last in combat. Asking them to handle paperwork for livestock taxes and similar matters was a task best left to someone else entirely. Under such circumstances, to welcome a well-informed individual who willingly steps up to carry the main burden was, by all accounts, a wonderfully fortunate development. That very night, after returning to my room alone, I commenced my study of the Sacred Flame Arts. After a cursory read-through of the sheepskin scroll, I discovered that the Sacred Flame Arts involve cultivating brilliance power levels, progressing from low to high, comprising the stages of light absorption, star radiance, moon, brilliance, sun, and apocalypse, totaling 5 distinct phases. Even at the lowest stage, light absorption, one can activate Brilliance Surge for half an hour daily, allowing brilliance powers to surge, amplifying one's own strength by 50%, and with each subsequent advancement, both the duration of the Brilliance Surge and its amplification effect would double, escalating to 8 hours of amplification at 8 times the power in the Apocalypse stage. Considering this, I eagerly began my cultivation practice. I discovered that I was, in fact, a true genius. The preliminary stage that typically requires months for most individuals to master, I managed to complete in mere moments. I initially intended to push straight through to the light absorption stage overnight, but diligence is hardly a skill expected of a genius like myself. Thus, I reclined onto my bed, and habitually glanced at my system panel before sleep. A single glance caused my already faint drowsiness to vanish instantly like smoke dissipating, and I excitedly sat bolt upright. This was because I found that the proficiency for the Sacred Flame Arts was displayed on my Strongest Lord Systems interface, and that this proficiency could be further enhanced using skill points. I gazed at the 57 free points I had diligently saved, and the long-suppressed stirrings within my heart at this very moment were becoming impossible to suppress. With sudden resolve, I furiously raised my middle finger, and frantically tapped the plus icon corresponding to the Sacred Flame Arts. The very next instant, I felt as if something akin to a miniature sun had been placed inside my chest cavity, perpetually radiating light and warmth outwards. I knew this was the Brilliance Core, and as the first Brilliance Core began to form, meaning I had now successfully stepped through the grand gates of Absorb Light Street. The very next morning, at the break of dawn, I promptly carried a comfortable chair and settled myself down in the open area where the most people gathered, adopting a profound and contemplative demeanor, eagerly awaiting someone to commend me with expressions of both adoration and utter astonishment. Oh, my lord, you are truly exceptionally brilliant. My lord, you actually managed to successfully advance your rank in just a single night. Yet, among this whole group of simpletons within High Mountain Fortress, there wasn't even a single person who genuinely recognized my achievements. While each of them greeted me with respectful bows, not a single one managed to offer the precise flattery I desired in the right spot. Fortunately, it was just then that the dwarf clan chief approached, conveniently rescuing me from my predicament by asking, "My lord, how should we proceed with those bronze weapons stored in our armory?" It turned out that every time we engaged in skirmishes or full-scale wars with the wild folk, we would occasionally confiscate a few pieces of ancient weaponry. I observed that these bronze weapons were all venerable old antiques, dating back many years, so I instructed the dwarf clan chief to first find a suitable and secure place to store them away, with the hope that they might fetch a very good price in the future. I had originally assumed that if the warehouse contained a few dozen bronze weapons at most, that would be quite impressive indeed. But what truly shocked me and made my jaw drop was this. The bronze weapons we had seized had actually accumulated into a veritable small mountain. This incredibly exaggerated quantity made me vaguely sense that something was seriously amiss. It isn't entirely unusual for wilderness natives to occasionally stumble upon a stroke of incredibly good fortune, and unearth a few ancient bronze armaments, so that in itself isn't particularly strange. However, having too much shit of this dogshit luck certainly raises a significant problem. Buckland carefully licked one of the bronze swords, confirming that this particular weapon originated from an ancient Suzuki workshop or a historical armory. Upon hearing Buckland's detailed analysis, I instantly found myself unable to suppress the overwhelming excitement bubbling up within my heart, and I burst out into a loud, hearty laugh. We're gonna strike it rich, so I immediately ordered my subordinates to summon the little shaman Loli. Because when it came to profound knowledge and understanding of the wilderness, no one in all of High Mountain Fortress could surpass this shaman who was a native of the lands. The shaman Loli informed me that all these dilapidated trinkets and broken items had been circulating from the wildfolk tribes residing in the eastern regions. Since they were considerably cheaper than standard iron weapons, many of the local tribes would consistently purchase them from those eastern wildfolk. Looking at this product, the Loli, I immediately felt an uncontrollable surge of exasperation. So, this product had actually known absolutely everything all along, and had simply kept it to herself, stubbornly refusing to speak up. The little lolly, meanwhile, felt utterly and terribly wronged. Our self-produced weapons are clearly 100 times more formidable and superior than these decrepit things. Why would my lord still care so profoundly about these pieces of scrap copper and useless junk? I gazed at the little lolly whose entire being emanated a pure, undeniable foolishness, and I consoled myself by internally reasoning, this one is merely inexperienced and simply lacks exposure. I truly shouldn't be angry or blame her for this. With that thought firmly in mind, I gently patted the little lolly on her shoulder and spoke with a friendly, smiling expression. Now, representing the entire organization, I am entrusting you with a truly formidable task. I will arrange for 10 capable warriors to accompany you. Your mission is to thoroughly investigate and discover exactly where these items truly originate from. And so, with her new assignment, the little lolly, accompanied by her 10 bodyguards, embarked on the journey to uncover the precise origin of the bronze artifacts. Fortunately, High Mountain Fortress, having weathered several difficult and hard-fought battles recently, had become increasingly well-known and respected through the tales spread by those they had defeated, and now stood as a formidable crimson demon treasure, feared by all who heard its name. Consequently, the moment the little lolly stepped out of High Mountain Fortress, her status immediately began to soar dramatically. The chieftains who were once so arrogant and haughty suddenly became almost fawningly subservient, frantically trying to curry her favor. Furthermore, those bronze artifacts had been openly circulating widely for a long time, and had never truly been concealed from public view. With just a little bit of inquiry, the little lolly quickly located the ancient ruins from which the bronze artifacts originally emanated. So, the very moment I was informed of the bronze artifact's location, I prepared to lead a group of my loyal subordinates to excavate all of the remaining bronze artifacts. In this manner, after a full week had passed, I personally packed up and successfully brought back every single bronze artifact from that ancient ruin. Moreover, I discovered that the murals adorning the ruins were exceptionally beautiful and captivating. Therefore, I specifically left a few talented rabbitmen there, instructing them to devise a method to carefully chisel down the exquisite murals. However, what remained utterly unknown to me was that I wasn't the sole individual with covetous eyes on these bronze artifact ruins. It was not just me, Hendra, the commander of the Stuart Kingdom's formidable Roaring Brown Bear Legion, that also developed a keen interest in this particular cache of ancient bronze artifacts. Who could have possibly imagined that this motley army, composed primarily of unruly wilderness brigands, would so effortlessly defeat an enemy force that vastly outnumbered them several times over? An official, regular army from a rival nation despite its superior numbers, simply because I, the lord of this ragtag army, had awakened the power of the ultimate lord's equipment, which not only allowed my newly recruited subordinates to continuously level up and grow stronger during battle, but also enabled me to procure all sorts of divine artifact equipment for them directly from the system's expansive marketplace. Just moments before, the bronze artifact ruins I had only recently occupied had indeed caught the predatory gaze of Hendra, the commander of the Roaring Brown Bear Legion of the Stuart Kingdom. As it turned out, Hendra, being a grandson of the Stuart Kingdom's esteemed Grand Marshal, after undergoing a period of rigorous training within the royal capital's elite royal guard alongside his several elder brothers, he was then ignominiously dispatched to a desolate, godforsaken frontier region, where he was appointed as the commander of the Roaring Brown Bear Legion. Although the title of Legion Commander might sound rather impressive and intimidating to the uninformed, any knowledgeable insider could immediately discern the true implications of the situation. Because the Stuart Kingdom's legion naming conventions followed a rigid and unalterable pattern. For instance, their elite first-line legions would proudly bear formidable names like Wrath of the Storm or Emperor's Shatter. Such names were always derived from powerful and destructive natural phenomena or cataclysmic events, while the second-line, more conventional legions would adopt the names of various powerful and fearsome magical beasts, such as the Bloodthirsty Black Dragon or the Raging Inferno. Only the absolute lowest-tier third-line local garrison legions would be named after common and ordinary wild animals like brown bear or wild boar. Such simplistic and ordinary beast names clearly denoted their inferior standing. Therefore, from the very day Hendra reluctantly accepted his appointment as commander of the Roaring Brown Bear Legion, He understood with chilling clarity that he had already been utterly abandoned by his family. However, Hendra was not someone who would ever readily concede defeat or give up easily, so he had been relentlessly and actively training his soldiers, hoping solely to lead his army to establish significant accomplishments and gain glory when war inevitably broke out in the future. While the feasibility of Hendra's chosen path was indeed exceptionally high, after all, in these turbulent and chaotic times, no one could ever truly predict with certainty precisely when a devastating war might suddenly erupt, yet his ambitious plan would undeniably require a substantial amount of financial investment to pave the way. Therefore, after Hendra quite unexpectedly obtained the precise location of the bronze artifact ruins, he promptly led his entire army to search for it. However, what proved to be utterly exasperating and deeply frustrating for Hendra was this: only a few scattered rabbit men who were still diligently carving murals remained within the ruins, and there were absolutely none of the precious bronze weapons that he so desperately desired. So, a furious Hendra immediately proceeded to slaughter every single rabbit man present on the spot, utterly annihilating them. And after Hendra learned that it was I, a mere frontier lord, who had brazenly taken the bronze weapons, he instantly made a rash and impulsive decision. He determined that before anyone else could discover their presence, he would launch a swift, unannounced, and bloody assault on High Mountain Fortress. And as for the people whom they couldn't possibly apprehend, everything that transpired here was secretly witnessed by one who had managed to sneak away, a rabbit man who had gone out to relieve himself and observed it all. Very swiftly, this crucial and important intelligence was then brought back to High Mountain. After all, an entire enemy legion was reportedly on its way. He was instantly utterly terrified, practically wetting himself in fear. He's already completely soaked himself now. If tens of thousands of people suddenly descend upon us all at once, we would be utterly and completely doomed. However, the well-traveled and vastly knowledgeable Buckland reassured me, telling me not to worry, explaining that in Stuart, any legion bearing the Brown Bear designation was invariably considered the weakest and most inferior. A third-line garrison legion, at its absolute maximum, would not exceed 3,000 soldiers. But Buckland's comforting words, despite his reasoning, did not allow me to fully relax my vigilance, because in comparison to the sheer number of enemy troops, whether or not the enemy possessed any high-ranking mages was, in fact, the most critically important factor. Although we also had 3 mages on our side within our own forces, a combination of 2 utter idiots and 1 complete slacker, just contemplating such a grouping made my head ache intensely. Anne, however, firmly stated, "My lord's excessive worrying is truly quite unnecessary and superfluous, because His Majesty Baruni of the Stuart Kingdom harbors an extremely heavy and profound sense of suspicion. In order to preempt any potential rebellions, he had, right at the beginning of his ascension to the throne, centralized the jurisdiction over all military mages across the entire nation back to the royal capital, only releasing them to the various armies during actual wartime. Therefore, the Roaring Brown Bear, a third-line garrison legion of this kind, could not possibly possess any attached mages or sorcerers." Upon hearing these incredibly reassuring words, I excitedly sprung to my feet. Since they do not have any attached mages with them, I will ensure this overconfident and foolish Roaring Brown Bear legion faces a one-way trip, never to return. Witnessing this dramatic scene, Buckland wore an utterly bewildered and dumbfounded expression, wondering what on earth could possibly make this idiotic lord so incredibly audacious and arrogant. As the newly appointed chief of internal affairs for High Mountain Fortress, he naturally knew with absolute certainty that High Mountain Fortress currently had no more than 600 combatants capable of participating in battle. Their own meager forces amounted to barely 1/5 of the enemy's strength. How could this utterly foolish lord still act with such an air of absolute certainty, as if victory were already guaranteed? He was actually already beginning to discuss with Anne the practical matters of monetizing the anticipated war spoils. Early the next morning, as the sun began to rise, I immediately began making extensive preparations for the massive battle that was soon to arrive. In order to completely mislead our adversaries, I gave a direct order for my subordinates to construct a deceptive false Lord's Hall right by the river's edge, and positioned not far from this fabricated Lord's Hall, I tasked Big Fool and Little Fool with using magic to pre-grow grave weeds over 3 meters tall. At last, on the 20th day of our preparations, our diligent centaur patrols encountered the enemy's reconnaissance scouts just outside the city walls. But even with the enemy's red monkey riders boasting exceptional horsemanship, they ultimately proved no match for the superior speed and agility of centaurs. Thanks to our innate racial advantages, after just a single round of confrontation, the enemy's red monkey rider was already struck through the chest by a sword and collapsed lifelessly onto the ground. This critical loss of a scout left Hendra completely blind, utterly ignorant of our local terrain and defensive layout. Therefore, when Hendra eventually laid eyes upon the towering 3-meter-tall grave weeds, he didn't give it much thought. Blinded by his eagerness to swiftly end the battle, as soon as his formation was aligned, he impatiently commanded his subordinates to launch a full-scale charge forward. Witnessing this unfolding scenario, I immediately twisted my body into an unnatural arc and bellowed loudly, "Brothers, press down on them, crush them utterly." Gazing at the Highland barbarians, whose physiques far surpassed those of ordinary men, the barbarians charged forth with the ferocity and swiftness of raging tigers. Hendra was immediately struck by a chilling and unsettling premonition, realizing his foot soldiers would absolutely be no match for the formidable Highland barbarians. Therefore, to preempt any unforeseen and disastrous occurrences, Hendra decisively played his ultimate trump card, issuing an urgent command for his heavy cavalry units to immediately launch a full-force assault. For, in his strategic estimation, even though the Highland barbarians held a clear and absolute advantage in direct combat, as long as his heavy cavalry could forcefully smash directly into the Highland barbarians' formation, the terrifying destructive power of his heavy cavalry would be more than sufficient to resolve any and all issues. However, precisely as Hendra's highly anticipated heavy cavalry were nearing the critical battlefield, a sudden, unexpected commotion erupted from within the dense graveweed thickets. In the very next instant, dozens of enormous terrain dragons surged forth from within, charging out in perfect, synchronized formation. Furthermore, each of these powerful terrain dragons was outfitted with specialized, full-enclosure defensive plating. This ingenious design not only offered superior protection to the Skald standard bearers, but also enabled the riders to safely and securely operate while mounted atop their terrain dragons. Their powerful air rifles, swiftly, my ultimate overlord terrain dragon legion vividly demonstrated, through their actual devastating performance, the very definition of unparalleled, world-shattering impact force. In a mere single round of their relentless charge, every enemy force standing in their path was violently thrown aside and utterly crushed beneath them, while those unfortunate enemies who managed to miraculously survive faced an even more tragic fate. This was due to the fact that our trio of somewhat unconventional mages had also entered the chaotic fray of the battlefield. Even though the little lowly's mind wasn't exactly the most quick-witted or active, the fireball spells she unleashed could still inflict absolutely devastating fatal blows upon the already struggling and overwhelmed enemy forces, delivering crippling strikes that decimated their ranks. Witnessing this escalating disaster, Hendra's face instantly contorted, consumed by an explosive surge of fury. He then spun around, gently stroking Shiju's head with a chillingly calm demeanor, and spoke in a cold, ominous tone. "My little darling, go forth and eliminate those 3 despicable mages on the opposing side." In the very next instant, Shiju erupted with a burst of full, blinding agility, launching herself directly towards the unsuspecting mage trio with murderous intent. Upon witnessing this terrifying sight, the little lowly was instantly so utterly terrified that her diaper became thoroughly soaked through with fright, frantically slapped the big oaf's head, desperately screaming at the top of her lungs, "Run, quickly." However, Big Fool and Little Fool mistakenly believed the little lowly was simply engaging them in a playful game of chase, and thus merely grinned foolishly and benignly back at her, showing absolutely no inclination or intention of fleeing whatsoever. Concurrently, at that very moment, Shiju, having already charged well within the mage's magical attack range, proudly swelled her massive chest, then opened her formidable hooked maw wide, and abruptly unleashed a torrent of scorching crimson flame in a continuous pillar. It was precisely at this dire moment of profound crisis that the little lowly, with the most fluid and rapid incantation of her entire life, completed her magical spell, unleashing a scorching fireball with the devastating force of a thunderbolt. The fierce fireball and the blazing pillar of flame violently collided in midair, culminating in a colossal, deafening roar and a blinding explosion. Seizing the precise moment when everyone's attention was irrevocably drawn by the deafening explosion, Hendra burst forth, his entire form enveloped in a shimmering aura of silver-white combat energy, and aggressively swung the long sword clutched in his hand directly towards me. I instantly executed a deep backbend, twisting my body, deftly evading the lethal trajectory of his fierce attack with incredible precision. As I then quickly turned my head to glance back, I was shocked to see that a massive gaping crater had already been carved into the ground directly behind where I had stood. At this tense juncture, Hendra, with an expression of blatant arrogance on his face, then addressed me, stating, "I, Hendra Gunawin, do not stoop to slay nameless nobodies. State your name if you dare." Upon hearing his boastful proclamation, I responded with utter disdain, spitting out a thick glob of phlegm that felt as aged as 82 wine. "Those about to die are utterly unworthy of ever knowing my true name. Any who dare to causelessly invade the cherished mountain lands of this lord shall receive no mercy and face absolute annihilation." Hendra was instantly enraged, absolutely seething with fury at my utterly arrogant and overbearing attitude. He raised his longsword high, and once more charged at me with murderous intent. I effortlessly parried his weapon with a light upward thrust, swiftly following with an overhead chop, a diagonal slice, and a horizontal sweep me signature, 3 deadly axes combo. However, Hendra's formidable battle aura possessed inherent force-deflecting properties, rendering it no easy task to simply block his powerful heavy blows with a single hand. Yet, Hendra, though seemingly already at the absolute end of his strength and tenacity, shockingly allowed a peculiar and unsettling smile to flicker across his face at this precise moment. It became immediately clear that Hendra's personal guards had already swiftly raised their long spears, moving to deftly stab at me from directly behind. What Hendra remained entirely unaware of was that he wasn't the sole individual on this battlefield who had meticulously prepared a hidden, powerful trump card. In the next decisive moment, I immediately activated my recently acquired, powerful skill, Feast. Prayer, a distant. I could feel my strength surging, my body brimming with renewed vigor as I unleashed a full-power, devastating blow while in that heightened state, which instantly cleaved all three unsuspecting ambushers cleanly into two distinct halves. This string of successive and humiliating failures caused the fierce resentment etched on Hendra's face to intensify so profoundly that his facial features visibly contorted into a grotesque mask of fury. Thus, he resolved to unleash every last ounce of his battle aura, surging forward with a desperate, all-out charge, intending to engage me in a desperate life-or-death struggle. But how could the current Hendra possibly stand a chance against me, whose formidable power had just been amplified twofold? He was no match for my newly augmented strength, and delivered a fierce, decisive kick directly to his face, bringing an abrupt and definitive end to this rather tedious skirmish.